A small community is rattled when a missing grandmother turns up brutally murdered off a remote Florida highway.
Both of the upper arms were cut around the shoulder areas.
The body had been dismembered. Just the way that that was done is gruesome.
The investigation will take authorities across state lines as a complicated family history surfaces.
Our initial diagnosis was paranoid schizophrenic. She had taken off in the middle of the night without any word.
As police search for answers, suspicion will grow closer to home and to a couple with desperate secrets of their own.
He snapped in every sense of the word.
I mean, you gotta be a little bit off in the mind to do that type of thing.
Sometimes we tell untruths for self-preservation, fright, to protect others.
If she didn't help, he was gonna dispose of 2 bodies.
I couldn't take the pressure no more.
That was rage uncontained.
Brevard County, Florida is an oasis for residents and visitors alike.
Brevard County is known as the Space Coast. Actually, many years ago, they changed their area code to 321, which is the countdown to relate to the Space Center.
This is where we sent men to the moon. It's also where we have all types of waterways, beautiful beaches, 72 miles of coastline.
On May 14th, 2013, authorities are alerted to a gruesome discovery along a remote highway.
A maintenance worker who was going to service a cell phone tower out in Miko. Now, if you know anything about Miko, it's a vast rural land.
He looked down into a ditch line and saw what he at first thought was possibly a deer or a hog.
As he looked closer, he actually noticed a skull, and he knew right away that was a human skull.
At that point, he made the 911 call, which came into the sheriff's office. Deputies responded. In that bottom area of the swale ditch were some plastic bags, and then the skeletal remains kind of spread out.
It appeared just to be the one body. We saw trash bags containing some of these skeletal remains, so we had a good idea we were dealing with a homicide-type investigation. This wasn't just a natural death where somebody was walking in a wooded area and fell and no one found them. It appeared someone went to great lengths to discard these remains and to hide them away from the general public so that they'd possibly never be found. We have really nothing but skeletal remains, so there was some concerns as to where do we start. We don't have an identity, we just have a witness. We want to know why he was there.
Generally, the person that finds the body is, of course, the first person we're going to interview.
The technician admits he wasn't scheduled to be there at all.
There's a cell phone tower at the end of this road. This man goes out to that tower every 6 months and does preventative maintenance, make sure that everything's working correctly for the cell phone companies.
As we continued to talk to him, you know, well, when was the last time you serviced the tower? It was just 3 months ago. Well, why now?
The technician is adamant that he was only there to do his job.
He explained that he was actually on a call out to check a tower that was actually south of our county. He explained the route that he took. He just decided he'd check this tower too, since he was in the area. As he was driving out to the cell site, he realized that he had to use the bathroom, so he thought this was a nice deserted area where he could stop and use the restroom without being noticed. We confirmed the company worked for, what their job function was, what his position was with the company, and you know, the fact that he was called out and the route that he takes, everything made sense as he explained it.
While investigators finish processing the crime scene, the skeletal remains are sent in for testing. The following morning, the medical examiner conducts an autopsy to determine more details about the victim and cause of death.
So first thing is that we took out the bones, we x-rayed them, and after x-raying them, then examined every bag of the bones. It was in advanced state of decomposition, mostly skeletonized.
The medical examiner actually put together the bones, like a puzzle.
It was determined to be a female, 60 to 80 years old.
He was able to identify the fact that there was blunt force trauma.
Most of the blunt force injuries were to the head area, like an eggshell fracture, so looked like some kind of heavy object like a ball peen of a hammer. Both of the upper arms were cut around the shoulder areas, and then the lower limbs also.
It was his belief that the body had been dismembered, that animals had not pulled it, that it had actually been cut, and he believed it was cut with some type of saw. Just the way that that was done is gruesome.
At this late stage of decomposition, identifying the victim will be difficult, but the medical examiner notices an important clue.
So when the medical examiner looked at the bones, what they found right around the rib cage was a pacemaker.
The pacemaker is inserted under the skin but over the rib cage. They are very specific to the patient at the time of the insertion.
Generally, anything that's implanted in the human body is categorized by serial number. The company has to keep where it went, what doctor got it, and eventually what patient it was put into.
We went to a local hospital that gave us different companies that the device could be from. So we called those companies and we were able to identify the company that owned the device. And the technician we spoke to, we provided him with the serial numbers. He was able to provide us with the name of the patient as Maureen Riccio. She was 70 years old.
While the pacemaker is sent off for data analysis, investigators focus on tracking down Maureen Riccio's next of kin and last known address.
Looking at electric records, water records, we were able to determine that she was residing in a house in the city of Melbourne. It was a rental. Our first thing is go to the landlord and talk to the landlord and find out what can they tell us.
They found out that Maureen was actually staying with her son, Frank Riccio, his girlfriend, Ilene, and their children.
The landlord said they were decent tenants. They had paid him for some time in advance when they first rented the property.
But they moved back to New York in April, leaving the house vacant.
So how had Maureen ended up the victim of a brutal crime in Florida?
If the remains weren't totally skeletonized, they were pretty close. They'd probably been out there close to 2 months.
So the timing was odd, because law enforcement believes that Maureen was killed in March and the family moved back to New York in April. Why hadn't the family reported her missing before then?
We need to speak with her family.
Coming up, investigators learn concerning details about their victim.
A couple of months, she just kept on, day and night, day and night. Havoc, havoc, havoc. I didn't know what to do.
She just packed up and walked out the door, and they never saw her again.
And new evidence will bring authorities closer to her killer.
There was a pretty significant crime scene at that location.
In Brevard County, Florida, authorities are investigating the murder and dismemberment of 70-year-old Maureen Riccio. 1 week into the case, homicide investigators contact the New York Police Department to track down Maureen's son Frank and his family after learning they had moved to Brooklyn nearly 6 weeks earlier.
We decided not to do a death notification and just work it as someone else has reported her as missing. We wanted to reach out to see what the response would be.
We're home. Frank and I were upstairs in our room, and Frankie, my son, happened to be downstairs on the video game. Doorbell rings. He goes to answer the door, and it happens to be an NYPD police officer. I go to the front door. The NYPD officer, he goes, "Do you know anything about the disappearance of Maureen Riccio?" And I said, "What do you mean?"
They were talking to Ilene at the front door, and we're inside the front foyer area at home. Frank eventually came out and entered the conversation.
Frank and Ilene tell police that Maureen had been living with them in Florida until she walked out after an argument and said she wasn't coming back.
And she's just acting up. And I just had enough, and she wanted to leave, and she flipped around. I didn't want to see either. Hear her anymore. I just said, go.
She just packed up and walked out the door, and they never saw her again.
We didn't report her missing because we figured she knew what she was doing in that sense.
Born in 1942, Maureen had always had a fiery personality.
My mother wasn't afraid of nothing. When she was younger, she took to people.
When Maureen was 18, her outgoing nature caught the attention of 37-year-old Thomas Riccio.
They started dating, they formed a relationship, and they got married. Shortly after they got married, Christine was born, July of 1961.
6 years later, the couple welcomed their son, Frank. But by 1970, Thomas and Maureen decided to separate.
Their father went to California. He would send money back on a weekly basis for the care of Christine and Frank.
But Maureen, actually, she didn't want Frank or his siblings, so she left.
She abandoned my father when he was a kid, and so my grandmother took care of my dad.
Frank was basically raised by his father's sister.
Frank was out of the house at like 16. He dropped out of high school and started working full-time. He was stable. He had a full-time job. He had his own apartment. He did what he had to do. Always did.
Growing up without his biological mother, Frank dreamed of building the strong family he never had. When he began dating Ilene Lazar in 1994, he knew he'd found the future mother of his children.
He said he sincerely loved me, and he knew that he wanted to spend my life with me, and that he would always take care of me. We did the whining, the dining, we did everything. Oh my gosh, he made me feel like a kid again. He had a way of shutting the world around and just making it all about me and him. And eventually, I found that I was pregnant with Andrea.
Frank and Ilene's daughter Andrea was born in 1995, followed by their sons Frank Jr. and Thomas. In 2006, the family of 5 relocated to Florida.
Frank was always into the buying, selling, and trading, which is how we established our home-based business. Frank was in Florida quite a few times over the course of the years for business. And he goes, we need a fresh start. So we moved to Florida.
In 2012, Frank and Ilene learned that Frank's mother, Maureen, had surfaced in New York, suffering from a myriad of health concerns.
Maureen was going back and forth in assisted living facilities up in New York, and Frank was becoming worried about that.
Despite Maureen leaving Frank as a child 4 decades earlier, Frank forgave his mother and invited her to move into their Melbourne, Florida home.
Maureen came to us right before Christmas of 2012.
When she came to our life, she was a very elderly woman who just needed care and someone to be there for her.
Frank felt that, being that it was his biological mother, that he owed it to her to go above and beyond and try to make her as comfortable and as welcoming as we could, which we did.
She was always trying to be like grandmother, always offering drinks, food, watching TV with us in the living room.
But the family quickly learned that Maureen's condition was more complicated than they'd anticipated.
Frank really didn't understand what the severity of her diagnosis really was.
Her initial diagnosis was manic depressive paranoid schizophrenic. So she was on like 12 medications 4 times a day. Neither him or I have any expertise in dealing with mental health issues.
Frank and Ilene explained to the officer that the situation had grown increasingly chaotic over the next 3 months.
She just kept on day and night, day and night. Havoc, havoc, havoc. I didn't know what to do. I was calling
What was she doing? What are some things that she would do?
Throw things at you, flip out, hurt yourself, scratch you, punch, everything.
She started having temper tantrums. She started having outbursts. It was like, literally, I felt like I was dealing with another 2-year-old.
The couple says despite their best effort, things only got worse. When Maureen walked out in March of 2013, they let her go.
Now, what happens the day that she leaves? You said that she walks off?
It was late. She was starting her antics. I want to leave. I want to go. I can't stay here. I can't take the heat. I can't take the bugs. I can't take the...
I go to get her meds together because she had to take her meds with food. I go to hand her her dish and I put it down next to her. She took the dish and freaking picked it up and flung it at me. The dish broke and freaking splattered.
They said she got mad and left.
She took a little bag of clothes with her.
Maureen had taken off in the middle of the night without any word or any sign or any letter or anything. That was just how Maureen was. Maureen was a fly-by-night kind of person and a nomad, and she would go from one place to the other.
She was getting Social Security, and she had a monthly check. She could take care of herself, and I think they were a little bit glad that she had left.
So you have no clue where Maureen went? New York. New York. So this is what she told me she was coming. And she left. I was thinking she was going to come back, but when she didn't come back, I was like relieved.
A few weeks later, Frank and his family decided to move back to New York as well, believing Maureen would contact them when she was ready to live with them again. Frank explains that he had paid the landlord several months' rent for their Florida home in case his mother showed back up after they left for New York.
He kind of expected someone would actually call and say, hey, your mom just wandered back. She's home. Can you come and take care of her? But he never received that call.
And they asked if we suspected foul play. And we both said that no, we don't suspect that there was foul play. We both suspected that she was just being Maureen. That's just how she was.
That's all I know.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn the seatbelt.
When the NYPD relay Frank and Eileen's story to Brevard County, investigators decide it's time to search the location Maureen was last seen alive.
What investigators needed to find out was if what Frank and Eileen told them, that Maureen walked out of their house in March, was true.
At that point, we secure a search warrant signed by a judge to go into that Melbourne house and to search it for evidence.
The agents decided to use luminol, which is a special chemical agent that helps to pick up blood spatter that isn't seen by the human eye. What the agents find is that there's a lot of hidden blood in that back bedroom.
There's a lot of blood, and the blood is spread out within that room, which is consistent with somebody being cut up.
At that point, we had determined that that had to be our scene of the crime. That was where Maureen had her last breath.
May 2013. In the weeks after the dismembered remains of Maureen Riccio were found in Brevard County, Florida, investigators have uncovered the presence of blood inside the home she once shared with her son Frank Riccio and his family.
There was a pretty significant crime scene at that location.
In one of the bedrooms, there was a ceiling fan that was missing. Some of the doorknobs were missing, some of the outlets were missing. The walls had been repainted, which was interesting to us because that would cover up blood.
It wasn't a good paint job. They'd actually painted not only the walls, but some of the electric outlets and including baseboards. The floor was scrubbed in like a new coat of wax because it was cleaner than the other parts.
Convinced they've discovered the location where Maureen was killed, investigators conduct a neighborhood canvass to determine if anyone has seen suspicious activity in the 6 weeks since Frank and Eileen claimed Maureen walked out.
There was one neighbor, I believe, that had had a little bit of contact with Frank. But for the most part, the neighbors really didn't know much other than they moved in, there was an older lady, and they had some kids.
None of them remembered strange people coming in and out of the house, just the people who lived there.
One neighbor actually saw Frank, moving things, packing things in the back of his truck during like the first week of April. Based on our cams in the neighborhood and some of the neighbors, we were able to identify the fact that Frank had a red pickup truck, and we learned that the truck was sold.
Frank had put it, I believe it was on Craigslist at that time, and put it up for sale and eventually sold it to a person.
As detectives continue canvassing the neighborhood, they learn about one telling exchange Frank had with his neighbor right before he and his family moved away.
Another neighbor had actually been approached by Frank. He was trying to figure out how he could cash one of his mother's Social Security checks without having her present.
Investigators are beginning to shape the theory that Maureen's murder could be financially motivated.
That information led us to reach out to the Social Security Administration to see if we could find out the status of her checks, both prior and current.
Investigators learned that when Frank took Maureen in, there was a $17,000 stipend. And then Maureen was receiving $700 a month after that.
If Frank was to take custody of his mother, he would gain financially. They could care for her with the money that they're being provided through her Social Security.
We found out there were still checks being issued to the Melbourne address.
Because Maureen's body was found nearly 20 miles away from home, investigators know they'll need to track down any vehicle that could have transported her remains. They start with the truck Frank sold on Craigslist.
We were able to find the transfer of title for the red pickup truck, and we found the person that had purchased it.
The pickup truck driver told him that Frank gave him a story about having to sell that truck because it wasn't big enough.
We did seize the truck and take the truck up to do some processing to see if there was any evidence that we could recover.
Unfortunately, we didn't obtain any evidence that would help us with our case.
Thankfully, investigators have better luck when they receive the results from the data analysis on Maureen's pacemaker.
We were told by the company that the pacemaker is kind of a computer, and it would be able to tell us when certain things happened in the body.
The technician from the pacemaker company, he showed us where there was an anomaly, where there was a spike in the heart rate for a period of time before there was no longer a heart rate, which is pretty much what he believed to be the time of death.
Based on the report, authorities now know Maureen was killed sometime between March 20th and March 27th, raising suspicions over Frank and Eileen's sudden move back to New York in April.
The original story, she just went missing. Is it possible? It's possible. Is it plausible? No.
Coming up, police revisit Frank and Eileen, leading to a harrowing confession.
And he just sat down and started rocking his knees, and he's like, "I'm sorry, God forgive me, I didn't mean it."
I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it.
2 weeks into the murder investigation of Maureen Riccio, Brevard County investigators have zeroed in on Frank Riccio and Eileen Lazar as their primary suspects.
We're trying to determine, what the motive would be.
The financial motive is something that we're contemplating because of the Social Security checks. And we've seen it happen quite often, where the death is not reported and the Social Security checks continue to come in.
Before traveling to New York to confront Frank and Eileen with the evidence, investigators reach out to friends and family who elaborate on Frank's complicated relationship with Maureen.
Maureen could be very aggressive and very abusive verbally, emotionally, mentally, and physically. I knew how my mom was, and I knew my brother had a temper.
According to family, Frank had tried to bring Maureen back to New York, but the assisted living facility threatened to have him arrested for negligence.
They said, if you bring him back to New York and drop him off like that, he goes, we're going to charge you. So at this time, Frankie felt trapped.
He was at the end of his rope with his mother. The relationship had soured long ago. It was already troubled, but it was getting worse.
With the evidence mounting, Brevard County investigators decide it's time to make the trip to New York and question Frank and Ilene themselves. On May 29, 2013, the couple is brought in for questioning.
We had Frank and Ilene separated. They were both telling us basically the same storyline. They were trying to appease Maureen, but she wasn't happy with anything they did. And at some point, she just decided she didn't want to be there, and she left.
At that point, we start to confront them with evidence, particularly with Ilene, knowing she might be the weakest link.
Under the circumstances, I was scared. I was afraid. My nerves were already shot at that time.
What do you think happened to Maureen?
I don't know what happened to her.
You don't know what happened?
No.
You know she didn't walk away.
Yeah, she did.
No, something cannot be disputed, okay? Maureen is dead.
Huh?
Maureen is dead.
Excuse me?
Maureen is not only dead, Maureen was hurt. Someone hurt her. Someone hurt her intentionally. Yes.
Oh my gosh.
We end up saying, hey, the ending that you're trying to sell is not the one that's part of the movie.
One detective pulled out photographs of her. Very, very detailed images, very detailed photos. He goes, tell us what happened to Maureen, because he goes, we know what happened to Maureen, which is why we're here. And then he used the kid card on me. How much do you love your kids? And I said, don't go there. They said, please don't go there. He goes, do you want to see your kids grow up?
Did Frank kill Maureen?
No.
Sometimes we tell untruths for self-preservation, fright, to protect others. But there comes a time when decisions have to be made. And this was a very tough decision.
Eventually, Ilene breaks down.
I said, I did what I did for the sake of my kids. But I said, I didn't do it. And then he goes, well, what exactly did you do?
Does someone just lose their temper and just lose control? What happens?
Frank was getting to the point that he would be out of the house all day, and I would be behind with the kids. He was heavily intoxicated. He came in, saw us freaking going at it into the altercation, told me, okay, don't worry, I'll take care of it.
Frank told Ilene to get the kids and go in a room, so she went in a room with the kids. She said she turned the television up in the room, and Frank had some type of altercation with Maureen outside of her sight.
What did you hear before you turned the volume? What kind of altercation they were having?
They were just yelling at each other.
You remember what they were saying?
She got really nasty with him. She was like, I hate you. I wish you were never born. Then he's telling her to shut up, and I can't take it, and you're killing my family. I don't know what else to do for you. And she just kept getting louder and louder.
Ilene tells investigators that the altercation seemed to end as soon as it began.
And then that was it. I didn't hear anything after that. I just heard dead silence until I heard the door open and I heard the door shut. And that's when he came into our room. And I said, are you okay? And he just sat down and started rocking his knees. And he's like, I'm sorry, God forgive me. I didn't mean it. And I said, what didn't you mean? He's not looking at me, and I literally got down on my knees, face to face with him. I grabbed his cheeks, and I said, tell me what you did. I said, I can't help you if you don't tell me what you did. He motioned for me to go into the room, and so I did because I couldn't get nothing verbal out of him. I turned on the light because it was dark. It was bloodshed. Everything was red. The walls, the blinds, the ceiling fan, the vents from the AC. There wasn't a drop of white anywhere. The floor, everything. Maureen was on the floor. I looked at her head, and she had one gaping hole. I knelt down to her and I held her hand. She took one final gasp. I went back into my room, and Frank is still sitting on the couch, rocking back and forth. I was thinking maybe if we go to bed, it'll just all be over in the morning. It'll just be a bad dream.
Ilene insists Frank left her no option but to participate in the cover-up.
So what was going through my mind was, I want to lose my kids. The kids have no idea what had transpired. We just told them that, she's sleeping. She slept like 12 to 15, if not more hours a day. And plus she liked being locked in her room, so they didn't think anything of it.
Frank and Ilene decided that they're going to get the kids off to school and then figure out what the next plan of action would be.
We knew that we had to get rid of her. Frank seemed like he had all the answers, and we went to the store.
They bought a circular saw, some tape, bags, even some cleaning solution.
She got back to the house. They laid out plastic, they put the body there, and they began using the saw to chop his mother into pieces.
He blindfolded my eyes so I wouldn't see anything. He didn't want me, visibly seeing anything, but it doesn't matter. I'm still tormented by the sounds. I could already hear the saw. I got splattered with the bone chips. I think that's what haunts me more than the actual scene itself. That's when it became surreal. That a human being could actually do this to another.
Ilene tells investigators she helped Frank clean up the scene and load everything into his truck.
He rolled it up to the window, and they began pushing the bags into the pickup truck, along with the bloody mattress and other material. And that's when he decided to go ahead and just take it and drive a short time later to Miko to dump the body.
I didn't want to hear details. I didn't want to know what was going to take place. I wanted to forget that it ever happened.
It's a harrowing story, but is Ilene telling the truth?
We believe she wasn't involved in the actual act of murder, but some of the things she did afterwards is really, you gotta be a little bit off in the mind to do that type of thing.
Now investigators must determine, had Frank committed an impulsive act of passion, or did Frank and Ilene conspire together to get Maureen's money?
You can deny, but at some point we're going to catch you on it.
Coming up, investigators confront Frank Riccio and attempt to prove Ilene's true involvement.
Obviously, there's some things at play.
I was scared to death.
I basically told him, I said, I'm gonna do whatever I have to do to get home as soon as I can.
In New York City, Ilene Lazar has admitted to helping the father of her children, Frank Riccio, dismember his 70-year-old mother Maureen's body inside their Melbourne, Florida home. Armed with Ilene's confession, investigators confront Frank.
Obviously, there's some things
I'm scared. I was scared to death.
At some point, he gave in. And right there, Frank confirms everything that Ilene had said, that Frank killed his mother.
It was a hammer.
Okay.
That was on the air conditioning thing. When she was flipping out, ripping her clothes off, screaming, going totally nutty, and it hit me. I turned around. I had a few drinks that night. I couldn't take the pressure no more, and I whacked her with the hammer.
Frank, when he tells us he didn't get as emotional as Ilene, he was just basically kind of telling it like, okay, this is what happened. It wasn't planned. It just got to a point that I couldn't take it anymore.
People need to hear my story to understand that I'm not an animal.
Frank insists his girlfriend Ilene had nothing to do with it.
He wanted to take full responsibility. He was remorseful about it and didn't want to see her get charged with anything at all.
He told them whatever he was gonna face, he was gonna face. But to go as easy on me as possible, being that I've never been in trouble.
According to Frank, killing Maureen Riccio was the tragic result of an impulsive decision fueled by anger.
That was rage uncontained. There's an emotional component to this particular case that you can't avoid. This is a person who was dealing with a mom, a mother, that had ran off and left him, abandoned him. She wouldn't take her medication. The children were afraid of her. Ilene was afraid of her.
After questioning Frank, investigators speak with his children and learn the person they fear most is not Maureen.
The kids eventually admit they've been kind of tasked into a story too, probably provided to them by Frank, and they remember some things as far as what happened that night.
My room was next to Maureen's. He left the door open, and literally I could see everything. He kept beating her and hitting her. And my dad has fists like 2 to 3 times bigger than mine. And she's just a small old lady. It was just merciless. It was a bloodbath. I was scared. I was with my sister and we ran to the other side of the house because we were like, are we next? My dad's 6'4". It's like 300 pounds and he's just a brute.
The couple's children believe their mother had no choice in the aftermath of Maureen's death.
I know my dad. If she didn't help, he was going to dispose of 2 bodies.
Florida police decide to charge Frank with first-degree murder.
Was it premeditated? I don't believe so. I believe he's angered and he made a poor decision.
He snapped in every sense of the word.
At that point, we weren't sure how we want to approach Ilene. Obviously, the kids were a factor, so Ilene was returned home to be with children.
But as authorities continue building their case, evidence surfaces that suggests Ilene may be more culpable than she or Frank have led them to believe.
Our investigative analysts were able to look up some databases and found where Ilene had actually pawned some items over several different days. And one of those items in particular was a circular saw.
So, of course, people have questions about her involvement.
Once I presented all the evidence to the state attorney's office and everything was reviewed, the decision was made to charge her as part of the full package of the case.
On June 10th, 2013, Ilene is charged with accessory to murder.
The kids, I sat all 3 of them down downstairs in the living room. They knew something was not right. And I basically told them that I love you. I don't know if I'll be able to see you, but I'm gonna do whatever I have to do to get home as soon as I can.
The state offers Ilene a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against Frank at trial. She agrees, But the case never makes it in front of a jury.
Frank pled to the charges that were presented, and he was sentenced to 25 years Florida State Prison.
I was looking at the max that Florida can issue you, which is 5 years. It was 4 years and 7 months. I was home.
I believe justice was served. I mean, she showed remorse and was very upset at what happened. I think if the family component wasn't at risk, she probably would have came forward right away. But it's that Mother Nature, protect the family at all costs.
I feel sorry for the kids because they're the ones getting the raw deal. No child should go through that. No child, no adult, no nobody.
Frank and Ilene, they loved each other. Ilene was by his side. And thick and thin, whatever the case may be, she decided to stick with him and follow through with his horrific plan to dispose of the body of his mother.
But I'm pretty sure my brother was not in his right mind, because anybody who does this could not be in their right mind. You know, I just couldn't picture my brother killing my mom. I didn't want to believe it. Nobody deserves to die the way she died.
My mom is back in my life, and I miss the hell out of her. So, like, I'm happy about that, but it does affect me sometimes not having a dad. I just hope that he gets whatever help he needs while he's incarcerated, and one day my dad will come home, hopefully.
I'll never be forgiven, ever. Ever. This is already over 10 years ago. Our lives are completely different. We're just trying to move on with everything.
We're doing better now than we ever were before. We're more functional now than we ever were before. For the first time in my life and the kids, we have stability. We have a foundation. We know where we're going, and that's everything.
I've always loved my mom. Sorry. Mom's an angel, and she always will be. She was just a pawn in the game. She can look past it and be greater in life than what she can ever imagine. I believe in her.
I've been to hell and back. It took me going through what I went through to prove to myself that, yeah, I'm going to be okay. I've got this. I'm strong. I'm stronger than I ever thought I was and will be.
For more than 4 decades, California lived with a question that refused to die. Who was the man who entered homes after dark, watched families from the shadows, raped women, murdered couples, and then disappeared before police could catch him? His name was unknown. His face was uncertain. His identity became one of the most haunting mysteries in American criminal history. Investigators had photographs, sketches, fingerprints, witnesses, physical evidence, and eventually something even more powerful, a DNA profile. But for years, the DNA had a cruel limitation. It could tell investigators that the same unknown man had committed multiple crimes. It could connect one terrifying attack to another. It could eliminate innocent suspects. But it could not tell them his name. The killer remained a biological signature without a human identity, and while investigators waited, decades passed. Victims aged, detectives retired. Evidence boxes gathered dust. Communities changed. The fear slowly became history. But the killer had never been forgotten. He was known by several names over the years: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and eventually the Golden State Killer. Different names, different jurisdiction, different victims. But investigators eventually understood that these terrifying crimes were connected to one man. The FBI later reported that between 1976 and 1986, the offender was linked to approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous residential burglaries across California. The first attacks began in the Sacramento area in 1976. Fear spread quickly. The attacker did not simply strike and vanish at random. He studied neighborhoods. He watched. He learned routines. He selected vulnerable homes. He created an atmosphere in which ordinary people began to question the safety of their own bedrooms, their own doors, their own street. FBI Special Agent Marcus Knutson later described the atmosphere in Sacramento during those years. Residents were so frightened that some slept with shotguns, bought dogs, and changed their locks. This was not simply a series of crimes. It became a psychological siege. The unknown offender seemed to understand that fear itself could become another weapon. And then came one of the most disturbing patterns in the entire case. In some attacks involving couples, the offender restrained both victims, sexually assaulted the woman, and then murdered the couple. The crimes were brutal, calculated, and terrifyingly personal. Yet the man responsible seemed able to vanish into ordinary life. That contradiction would eventually become one of the most astonishing elements of the case. For years, investigators searched for a stranger. They imagined someone who looked dangerous, someone who behaved suspiciously, someone whose past might reveal the darkness hidden beneath the surface. But the real answer would eventually be far more unsettling. The man investigators were searching for was not a ghost. He was a person who had lived an ordinary-looking life for decades after the murders stopped. He had a name. He had a home. He had a family. He had once worked in law enforcement, and for years, nobody could prove that he was the monster investigators had been hunting. The case began in 1976 with an attack in the Rancho Cordova, Carmichael area of Sacramento. From there, the crimes expanded. Investigators were confronted with an offender who seemed to evolve. In the early years, he became known as the East Area Rapist. Later, crimes farther south were connected to the original Night Stalker. Eventually, investigators realized that the separate identities belonged to the same offender. The geographical distance had created another obstacle. One police department might have information another department did not possess. One investigator might see a pattern that another never had the opportunity to see. Before modern databases, before instant digital communication, before forensic genealogy could transform an old DNA sample into a family tree, investigators had to build the connection piece by piece, and every year that passed made the mystery colder. Yet the evidence remained. That was the critical fact. The killer could disappear, witnesses could forget, investigators could retire, technology could become obsolete, but biological evidence could survive. Somewhere inside old evidence containers, in files preserved through decades of investigation, was a microscopic clue that had already outlived the manhunt. DNA the killer had left behind, something he could not erase. For years, investigators used that evidence in the traditional way. They compared it against available profiles. They tried to find a direct match. Nothing. No name. No suspect. No arrest. The DNA seemed to say the same thing over and over. The crimes belonged to one man, but nobody knew who that man was. In 2016, after 4 decades, federal and local authorities launched a renewed national campaign to identify the East Area Rapist/Golden State Killer and offered a $50,000 reward. The FBI publicly acknowledged that the investigation remained active and that DNA from multiple crime scenes could help eliminate innocent suspects. It was an extraordinary moment. 40 years had passed, yet investigators were still asking the public for help. The killer had become a symbol of the cold case itself, a crime that seemed too old to solve, a mystery that technology had not yet conquered. But the investigators were not starting from nothing. They had something that earlier generations of detectives could only have dreamed of, a biological fingerprint. The question was no longer simply whether the killer had left DNA. The question was whether science had finally advanced far enough to turn that DNA into a name. And that question would change everything, because somewhere in California, an elderly man was living under the radar of the investigation. His name was Joseph James Dungello. He was born in 1945. He had served as a police officer. He had lived in California for decades, and in the spring of 2018, investigators would finally begin closing the distance between the unknown DNA profile and the man who carried it. The breakthrough did not arrive with a dramatic confession. It did not begin with a witness suddenly remembering a fate. It began with a scientific technique that could look beyond the suspect himself and search through the genetic relationships connecting families. Investigative genetic genealogy offered investigators a new path. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" they could ask a different question. Who might be related to the person whose DNA is this? The distinction was enormous. The DNA that had once represented a dead end could now become a map. Investigators could build family connections, narrow possibilities, examine geographic and genealogical relationships, and eventually focus on individuals whose lives intersected with the evidence. The case that had survived 40 years was entering a completely different era. The Golden State Killer had spent decades being defined by what investigators did not know. They did not know his name. They did not know where he was. They did not know whether he was alive. They did not know whether he was still capable of violence. They did not know whether he had watched the investigation from a distance. But now, after decades of silence, the investigators were getting closer. And the most shocking part was still ahead, because the man they were searching for was not going to emerge from the shadows. Investigators were going to find him living in plain sight. On April 24th, still 2018, Sacramento law enforcement arrested Joseph James D'Angelo, then 72 years old. The FBI later described the arrest as the culmination of an investigation that used investigative genetic genealogy to narrow the pool of suspects. Identified D'Angelo. The mystery that had haunted California for decades suddenly had a name. The cold case was no longer cold. The DNA profile finally had a face. And after 40 years of silence, the question that investigators had asked since 1976 had finally received its answer. But an answer to a mystery is not the same thing as an ending, because for the survivors and families who had carried those memories for decades, the arrest was not the moment when the story disappeared. It was the moment when the past came rushing back. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo transformed the Golden State Killer case from an unsolved mystery into one of the most consequential cold case breakthroughs in modern American criminal justice. But the story behind that breakthrough had been building for decades, long before anyone knew the name Joseph D'Angelo. The case had begun in a California that looked radically different from the one in which the killer was finally identified. There were no smartphones, no internet search engines, no consumer DNA databases, no instant digital communication between police departments separated by hundreds of miles. Investigators worked with paper files, physical evidence, sketches, interviews, handwritten reports, telephone calls, and forensic techniques that were primitive compared with those available decades later. The killer operated inside those limitations. He benefited from them. Every attack generated evidence, but evidence was only useful if investigators could interpret it. Every witness saw something, but memory was imperfect. Every crime scene contained clues, but technology determined which clues could be recognized. And while investigators struggled to connect the crimes, the offender moved across jurisdictions, creating an investigative maze that would take years to fully understand. In Sacramento County, the attacks created a wave of fear that affected entire neighborhoods. According to the FBI, residents changed locks, bought dogs, and some even slept with shotguns because they believed the attacker could strike again. The fear was rational. The offender had demonstrated that ordinary security measures could not guarantee safety. He could enter homes. He could observe people without being noticed. He could disappear. And perhaps most frightening of all, he seemed to know that investigators were searching for him. His behavior created the impression of a predator who understood the environment around him. The early crimes became associated with the name East Area Rapist, but the investigation did not remain confined to Sacramento. As years passed, similar crimes were reported farther south. investigators began recognizing connections between cases that had initially appeared unrelated. The same offender could now be associated with multiple names because different jurisdictions had encountered different portions of his criminal history. The FBI later summarized the scale of the crime spree as approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries between 1976 and 1986. That number alone tells only part of the story. Each statistic represented a person. Each case number represented a crime scene. Each investigation involved detectives who had to reconstruct what happened from fragments, and each unsolved case left a family without the certainty that comes when the person responsible is identified. In the years after the attacks, investigators preserved evidence. That decision would prove critical. The biological material collected from crime scenes eventually allowed investigators to establish a DNA profile belonging to the unknown offender. It was an extraordinary scientific development because DNA could accomplish something eyewitness testimony often could not. It could establish a connection between crimes with an objectivity that did not depend on a witness remembering a face correctly. It could show that apparently separate cases were linked by the same biological source, and it could eliminate suspects who were not the offender. But the DNA also created a strange kind of frustration. Investigators knew what the killer's biological signature looked like. They simply did not know the man behind it. For decades, that distinction remained absolute. A DNA profile without a matching individual was like a fingerprint without a database. It was precise, but incomplete. Investigators could say, with increasing confidence, that the same unknown man had committed multiple crimes. They could not say who he was. The case, therefore, became a contest between time and evidence. Time favored the killer. Evidence favored the investigators as years turned into decades. Witnesses aged. Some died. Memories faded. Detectives who had once walked the crime scenes retired. Yet the physical evidence remained. Then forensic science entered a new era. DNA databases expanded. Genetic research accelerated. Commercial genealogy databases became increasingly popular. Millions of people voluntarily submitted genetic information for ancestry and family history purposes. Those databases were not created to solve murders. They were created to help people understand their ancestry and locate relatives. But investigators eventually recognized that genetic relationships could potentially provide a new route into cold cases. The FBI explains that forensic genetic genealogy differs from traditional familial searching and can use genetic information from non-law enforcement databases to identify relatives of an unknown offender. That concept changed the investigative landscape. The killer no longer had to be directly present in a law enforcement database. Investigators could potentially find his relatives instead: a cousin, a distant family connection, a branch of a family tree that eventually led toward the unknown suspect. It was not a simple process. It required genetic analysis, genealogical research, investigative work, and careful narrowing of possibilities. But in the Golden State Killer investigation, that approach became the breakthrough that conventional methods had failed to produce for more than 40 years. Investigators were able to use the old DNA evidence in a fundamentally new way. The unknown offender was no longer merely a biological profile. He became part of a family network. And from that network, investigators could begin constructing possibilities. The search narrowed. Names emerged. Backgrounds were examined. Locations were compared. Historical information was analyzed. Investigators were no longer searching an entire population. They were searching a much smaller universe of people connected through genetic relationships and investigative logic. Eventually, one name drew their attention: Joseph James D'Angelo. The discovery was startling not simply because of his age, but because of his background. D'Angelo had once worked as a police officer. The FBI had previously warned that the offender might have military or law enforcement interests or training, but that description had not solved the case. Now investigators were looking at a former officer who had lived in California and whose life could be examined against the evidence accumulated since the 1970s. The question became intensely specific. Was Joseph D'Angelo the man whose DNA had haunted investigators for decades? The answer would have to come from evidence. Investigators moved carefully. They needed confirmation. They needed to establish that the suspect connected to the genealogy was the same individual whose biological material had been recovered from the crime scenes. The final step was not about speculation. It was about DNA. In April 2018, that process reached its decisive moment. Joseph D'Angelo was arrested in Sacramento. The manhunt that had begun in the 1970s was suddenly over. But the arrest also produced a chilling realization. The killer had not vanished into some remote location. He had remained in California. He had grown old. He had lived decades after the last known crime associated with him. And during those years, the victims had carried the consequences of what he had done. The arrest could not erase the attacks. It could not return the dead. It could not give survivors back the years stolen from them. But it could finally replace one unbearable uncertainty with a fact. The Golden State Killer had a name. Joseph James D'Angelo. The DNA had spoken. The silence had been broken. And now, for the first time in more than 40 years, the case would move from the darkness of an unsolved investigation into the public light of the courtroom. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo did not arrive like the dramatic ending investigators had imagined for more than 40 years. There was no suspect cornered after a high-speed chase, no confession delivered in a dark interrogation room, no anonymous tip suddenly revealing the killer's location, because the manhunt had ended in a way almost nobody could have predicted, with an elderly former police officer living an apparently ordinary life suddenly becoming the center of one of America's most notorious murder investigations. And the moment investigators placed D'Angelo under arrest on April 24th, SIL 2018, the decades-old mystery surrounding the Golden State Killer finally had a human fate. For survivors and families, however, the name did not immediately bring relief. It brought questions. How could this man have remained unidentified for so long? How had he avoided detection after leaving behind biological evidence? What had happened to the evidence collected in the 1970s and 1980s? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, had investigators really been looking for the right kind of person? D'Angelo was 72 years old when he was arrested, meaning that the man suspected of terrorizing California decades earlier had been living through the same years that the investigation continued to struggle forward. He had aged while the case aged with him. The killer had not been frozen in time, but the evidence had been. That was what made the breakthrough so extraordinary. For decades, investigators had possessed DNA capable of connecting crimes, but conventional DNA searching had failed to identify a suspect. Investigative genetic genealogy changed the direction of the search by allowing investigators to look for biological relatives of the unknown offender and construct genealogical connections that eventually narrowed the field. The technique became one of the most important developments in the case because it transformed DNA from a simple identification tool into an investigative roadmap. But even after D'Angelo became a person of interest, investigators could not simply assume the answer was correct. The stakes were enormous. The Golden State Killer investigation involved years of evidence, multiple jurisdictions, numerous victims, and crimes separated by distance and time. An accusation based solely on an intriguing genealogical connection would never be enough. Investigators needed confirmation. They needed to establish that the 72-year-old man standing before them was biologically connected to the evidence preserved from the original crime. That meant watching, waiting, and obtaining DNA from D'Angelo without alerting him to the full scope of the investigation. According to accounts released after the arrest, investigators collected discarded biological material associated with D'Angelo and used it for comparison with a DNA profile developed from the crime scenes. The result was devastatingly significant. The biological evidence connected D'Angelo to the offender profile investigators had preserved for decades. Suddenly, the unknown man who had existed in police files as a nameless biological signature had become Joseph James D'Angelo. The case had crossed an extraordinary threshold. The question was no longer whether the East Area rapist, original Night Stalker, and Golden State Killer were the same person. Investigators had already spent years establishing those connections. Now the question was, what would happen when the evidence was brought into court? Prosecutors in California moved forward with an enormous case. The charges reflected the violence associated with D'Angelo over decades, including murders and kidnappings, while the broader body of crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer extended far beyond the counts that could ultimately be prosecuted. The arrest immediately reignited public attention. News organizations around the world reported that the mystery that had haunted California since the 1970s had finally been solved. For many people who had followed the case, the arrest seemed almost unbelievable. The killer had been identified not through a confession or a dramatic eyewitness revelation, but through a scientific trail connecting generations of a family tree. The technology that eventually exposed him had not existed when the first attacks occurred. In 1976, nobody could have imagined that decades later, investigators would be able to use genetic genealogy to search for a suspect through distant relatives. That was the strange irony at the heart of the case. The killer had survived the technological limitations of the 20th century, only to be caught by a scientific method that belonged to the 21st. But as investigators and prosecutors examined the evidence, another disturbing reality emerged. The crimes had never really been forgotten. Survivors had carried them for decades. Some had built families. Some had changed homes. Some had tried to move forward without knowing whether the person who had attacked them was still alive, still watching, or still capable of violence. The uncertainty itself became part of the trauma. When D'Angelo was arrested, that uncertainty was replaced by something else, the knowledge that the person responsible had been found. For investigators who had worked on the case across generations, the arrest represented the culmination of an extraordinary effort. Detectives who had once chased the East Area rapist were no longer dealing with a faceless offender. They finally had a suspect. But the investigation did not end with the arrest. It accelerated. Authorities had to reconstruct the crimes, examine evidence from different jurisdictions, interview survivors, coordinate prosecutors, and determine which charges could be brought against D'Angelo. The sheer passage of time created obstacles. Some original witnesses were no longer alive. Some evidence had been collected under standards very different from modern forensic practice. Memories had aged alongside the case. Yet the physical evidence remained remarkably powerful. The DNA profile was the thread that connected the decades. Investigators could trace the offender through biological evidence even when geography, names, police agencies, and years separated one crime from another. And as the prosecution developed, the public began learning more about the man behind the terrifying aliases. D'Angelo had served as a police officer in California in the 1970s. That fact shocked many people because law enforcement had been searching for an offender while the eventual suspect had himself worn a badge. His background made the story even more unsettling. The person accused of committing crimes that generated enormous fear had possessed knowledge of policing and the communities where he lived. But investigators still had to prove what they alleged. The courtroom would become the next battleground, and the evidence accumulated over 4 decades would be placed under intense scrutiny. The prosecution eventually assembled a case involving 13 murders and 13 kidnappings, counts that represented only part of the broader criminal history attributed to D'Angelo. In June 2020, more than 2 years after his arrest, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery, while prosecutors said the plea allowed him to avoid a possible death sentence and provided a legal resolution for crimes committed across several California counties. The guilty plea eliminated the need for a lengthy trial, but it did not eliminate the emotional force of the case. D'Angelo's admission meant that the families who had waited decades no longer had to wonder whether investigators had arrested the wrong man. The evidence and the plea converged. The unknown predator who had haunted California for decades had finally acknowledged responsibility for the crimes represented by the charges. But there was another element that made the case extraordinary. The Golden State Killer had not been caught because one investigator suddenly discovered a forgotten clue. He had been caught because generations of investigators refused to allow the case to disappear, because biological evidence was preserved, because forensic science evolved, and because a new investigative method created a bridge between an unknown DNA profile and a living suspect. The case became a landmark example of how cold cases can be transformed when old evidence meets new technology. Yet beneath all the headlines, the science, and the courtroom drama was a simpler truth. For 40 years, the victims had known the crimes. Their families had known the losses. Their communities had known the fear. Only the identity of the offender had remained hidden. When investigators finally placed a name beside the DNA profile, they did more than solve a mystery. They restored a missing piece of history. The Golden State Killer was no longer an anonymous figure moving through old police files. He was Joseph James D'Angelo, a man who had been identified through the biological evidence he left behind decades earlier. The evidence had survived him. The investigation had survived him. And eventually, the technology caught up with the crime. But even with the killer identified and the legal case moving toward its conclusion, the most difficult question remained unanswered in a different sense. How does a community live for decades with a nightmare, only to discover that the nightmare had been walking quietly through the same world all along? That question would haunt the case long after the handcuffs were closed around D'Angelo's wrists, because solving a cold case can identify the person responsible, but it cannot erase the years of fear that came before the answer. It can give a name to the unknown. It can give families a measure of certainty. It can close a courtroom file, but it cannot turn back time. And in the Golden State Killer case, time was exactly what had made the mystery so powerful. 40 years had passed before the DNA finally pointed directly toward Joseph James D'Angelo, and when the silence finally broke, it did not sound like an ending. It sounded like the past returning all at once. Before Joseph James D'Angelo had a name, the investigation had a pattern. Before detectives knew the identity of the man whose DNA would eventually expose him, they knew something was moving through California communities with terrifying consistency. The attacks did not appear all at once as one recognizable crime spree. They emerged as fragments: one home, one neighborhood, one frightened survivor, one crime scene, then another, then another. Each incident seemed to belong to its own jurisdiction, its own police report, its own investigation, until the similarities became impossible to ignore. The man investigators would eventually identify as the Golden State Killer began his known series of attacks in the Sacramento area in 1976, where he became known as the East Area Rapist. The name itself reflected the geography of the early investigation, but the terror did not remain confined to one part of California. The offender moved, and as he moved, the investigation became more complicated. He was not simply crossing streets. He was crossing jurisdictional boundaries, creating gaps between police agencies that would take years to close. The FBI later described a criminal history involving approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous residential burglaries between 1976 and 1986. But statistics cannot fully explain the atmosphere surrounding the attack. What terrified communities was not only the violence, it was the uncertainty. Residents did not know when the offender would strike, where he would appear, or how he seemed to know which homes to target. The attacks created an environment in which people began changing ordinary habits. Doors were checked repeatedly, locks were strengthened, dogs were purchased. Some residents slept with firearms nearby. The FBI later described how fear spread across Sacramento neighborhoods as residents tried to protect themselves from a predator who seemed capable of entering homes at night and disappearing without being caught. The killer's behavior created another problem for investigators. He did not leave behind a single simple signature that could immediately solve the case. Instead, detectives had to reconstruct his behavior from multiple crime scenes. Investigators interviewed victims and witnesses. They examined physical evidence. They compared descriptions. They looked for similarities in methods, timing, locations, and victim selection. Every detail mattered because one apparently insignificant similarity could connect to cases separated by miles or months. At first, the crimes were treated as individual incidents. But eventually, investigators began seeing the larger picture. The same unknown offender appeared to be responsible for numerous attacks. This recognition was crucial because it transformed the investigation. Instead of searching for someone connected to one crime, detectives were now searching for one individual connected to a growing series of crimes. The more cases they connected, the more terrifying the offender became. Yet the investigation also gained something valuable: a larger evidence base. Each connected crime potentially provided another clue. Each recovered biological sample potentially strengthened the offender's DNA profile. Each witness statement added another fragment to the description of the man investigators were pursuing. But the larger the case became, the more difficult it was to manage. The offender's crimes eventually extended beyond Sacramento. In Southern California, investigators encountered a similar pattern of attacks and murders associated with what became known as the original Night Stalker. The different names reflected the way law enforcement agencies had understood the crimes at different points in time. For years, the connection between the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker remained unresolved. Investigators knew they were hunting dangerous offenders, but they did not initially know they were hunting the same man. That separation mattered. A criminal who could cross county lines could also cross investigative boundaries. Information that seemed irrelevant to one agency could become decisive to another. The absence of modern digital systems made the problem even greater. Today, investigators can compare records, databases, DNA profiles, vehicle information, digital communications, and countless other data points with extraordinary speed. In the 1970s, such comparisons required physical records and communication between departments. The Golden State Killer benefited from an era in which information moved more slowly than he did. But investigators refused to stop. They continued collecting evidence. They continued comparing cases. They continued trying to understand the offender's behavior. And eventually, DNA transformed the investigation. Biological evidence recovered from the crimes allowed investigators to establish that the same offender was responsible for multiple attacks. That was a breakthrough, but it also created one of the most frustrating situations imaginable. Police knew they had the same perpetrator. They simply did not know who he was. The DNA profile became a silent witness. It could speak with extraordinary precision about biological identity, but only if investigators had something with which to compare it. Without a matching individual in an accessible database, the profile could not produce a name. It could only produce certainty that the same unknown man was involved. That certainty mattered enormously. It helped investigators connect crime. It helped eliminate suspects. It strengthened the understanding of the case, but it did not put handcuffs on anyone. The killer remained free. Years passed, then decades. The aliases accumulated. East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, eventually Golden State Killer. Each name reflected a different stage in the understanding of the case, but none revealed the man himself. For survivors, the aliases did not matter. They knew the person who had entered their lives. They knew the fear. They knew the consequences. What they did not know was whether they would ever hear the words that investigators eventually delivered in 2018. We know who did this. The investigation reached a critical stage when authorities renewed their public efforts to identify the offender. In 2016, the FBI and Sacramento authorities announced a national campaign and offered a $50,000 reward. The message was clear. After 4 decades, investigators were still pursuing the case. They were not willing to let time become an excuse for surrender. The public campaign also reminded people that the investigation was built on evidence, particularly DNA, that could potentially eliminate innocent suspects and identify the person responsible. But behind the scenes, forensic science was changing faster than the investigation itself. The emergence of genetic genealogy offered something conventional DNA searches could not. Investigators no longer had to wait for a direct match to appear in a law enforcement database. They could potentially search for genetic relatives and work backward through family trees. This was the turning point. The killer's DNA had spent decades sitting in evidence files like a locked door. Genetic genealogy provided a key. Instead of asking only whether the offender's DNA belonged to someone already known to police, investigators could ask whether that DNA shared identifiable genetic relationships with people who had voluntarily submitted information for genealogy purposes. The approach did not instantly produce Joseph D'Angelo. It narrowed possibilities. It created investigative leads. Genealogists and investigators could construct family relationships, identify branches, examine ages and locations, and eliminate people who could not fit the known facts. The process was painstaking, but the cold case was finally moving. The manhunt was no longer entirely dependent on memories from the 1970s. It had entered a scientific era in which the offender's DNA could point beyond himself. Eventually, investigators focused on Joseph James D'Angelo. His background was notable. He had worked as a police officer in California, a fact that would later attract enormous attention. The idea that a former law enforcement officer could be the person investigators had hunted for decades was deeply unsettling. But investigators still needed proof. They needed to connect the suspect to the biological evidence. They needed to move from genealogy to forensic confirmation. And that confirmation would come through DNA. D'Angelo was under surveillance. Investigators watched him without revealing the full reason for their interest. Then they obtained biological evidence associated with him and compared it with the DNA profile from the crime. The result provided the link they had been searching for since the 1970s. On April 24, 2018, authorities arrested D'Angelo at his home in the Sacramento area. After 4 decades, the unknown offender finally had an identity. The manhunt that had stretched across generations had ended, yet the arrest also revealed something profound about the nature of cold cases. Sometimes the evidence does not fail. The technology fails to catch up with it. The DNA had been there. The connection had been there. The answer had been buried inside a biological profile waiting for investigators to develop a method capable of reading it. The Golden State Killer case became a demonstration of what can happen when old evidence meets new science. But for the victims and families, the breakthrough was not simply a scientific achievement. It was a moment that reopened memories that had never truly disappeared. The crimes were no longer anonymous. The man responsible was no longer a shadow. Joseph James D'Angelo now stood at the center of the investigation, and with his arrest, the aliases began collapsing into a single identity. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Golden State Killer, different names, one man, one DNA profile, one case that had survived 40 years, and now, finally, one suspect who could no longer disappear into the darkness. For 40 years, the most important witness in the Golden State Killer investigation had never spoken a single word, never appeared in a courtroom, never pointed a finger at a suspect, and never gave investigators a name. It was DNA hidden inside biological evidence preserved from crimes committed in the 1970s and 1980s. That genetic material became the thread connecting a terrifying series of attacks across California, and eventually, decades after the first victim encountered the unknown intruder, that thread would lead investigators to Joseph James D'Angelo. The remarkable part of the story is that the DNA did not suddenly become useful in 2018. It had been useful for years. What changed was the question investigators could ask of it. In the earlier stages of the case, investigators used DNA in a relatively direct way. They developed a profile from biological evidence and compared it with available records and known suspects. A match could identify an offender. A non-match could eliminate an innocent person. But if the offender's profile was not already connected to an identifiable individual, the search could stop there. The Golden State Killer's DNA became a kind of biological fingerprint without a name. It could connect crimes to one another, but it could not immediately reveal the person who had left it behind. That limitation became one of the central frustrations of the investigation. Detectives knew they were dealing with the same offender. They knew the biological evidence was powerful. They knew the person responsible had left behind something that could theoretically identify him. Yet conventional database searching repeatedly failed to produce the answer. The killer remained anonymous. This is what made the case so unusual. It was not an investigation without evidence. It was an investigation with evidence that could not yet be translated into an identity. The distinction became crucial as the decades passed. Investigators preserved the evidence, and future investigators inherited the responsibility of finding a new way to use it. The Golden State Killer investigation therefore became a story of scientific patience as much as police persistence. The evidence waited while technology evolved. By the 21st century, genetic science had changed dramatically. DNA was no longer simply a tool used by police laboratories to compare crime scene material with criminal databases. The public had also begun using genetic testing to explore ancestry and identify biological relatives. Millions of people submitted genetic information to commercial genealogy services, creating enormous networks of familial connections. Those databases were built for personal ancestry research, not for identifying murder suspects, but the underlying genetic relationships created a new investigative possibility. If investigators had DNA from an unidentified offender, perhaps they could find relatives who shared portions of that DNA. They might not find the killer directly, but they could potentially find the killer's family. From there, genealogical research could build a path toward the unknown individual. That concept changed the cold case investigation from a direct search into a relational search. Investigators were no longer asking only, "Who is this DNA?" They could ask, "Who is genetically connected to this DNA?" The difference was enormous. A direct search might produce nothing if the suspect had never entered a law enforcement database. A genealogical search could potentially produce distant relatives who had never committed crimes and had never been suspected of anything. Those relatives could provide the first pieces of a family tree. The family tree could then reveal branches. Branches could reveal geographic locations. Locations could reveal possible suspects, and possible suspects could be compared against the known facts of the crime. The process required specialized expertise and careful investigation. A genetic relationship alone did not prove guilt. It created a lead. Investigators still had to establish whether a particular person could have committed the crimes and whether independent evidence connected that person to the crime scene, DNA. In the Golden State Killer investigation, this methodology became the breakthrough. Investigators worked with genetic genealogy to identify potential family relationships connected to the unknown offender. As genealogical researchers examined those relationships, the enormous universe of possible suspects began shrinking. A case that had once involved an unknown man somewhere in California could now be approached through family history. Names appeared. Family branches were examined. Generations were reconstructed. Investigators considered age, location, and other known information. The search became increasingly focused. Eventually, Joseph James D'Angelo emerged as a person whose background could fit the investigative picture. D'Angelo was not a random name pulled from a database. He became the result of a narrowing process that combined genetic information with traditional police work. His history was examined. His movements were considered. His connection to California was obvious. His former career in law enforcement was notable. But the most important question remained biological. Did D'Angelo's DNA match the DNA from the Golden State Killer crimes? Investigators needed to answer that question without relying on assumptions. They obtained discarded biological material associated with D'Angelo and compared it with the offender profile. When the genetic evidence connected D'Angelo to the crime scene DNA, the decades-old investigation changed instantly. The anonymous biological profile had become a person. The person had a name, and that name belonged to a 72-year-old former police officer living in the Sacramento area. On April 24th, 2018, authorities arrested D'Angelo. The arrest sent shockwaves across California and around the world. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unsolved mystery. The man investigators had hunted for decades had been identified, but the significance of the arrest went beyond one suspect. It demonstrated the potential power of genetic genealogy in cold case investigations. For decades, law enforcement had relied on direct DNA comparison. Genetic genealogy opened another door by using family relationships to identify possible suspects. The Golden State Killer became one of the most famous examples of this approach. The science was powerful precisely because the offender did not have to be sitting inside a police database. His relatives could provide the indirect connection. The killer could remain absent while his genetic family history pointed toward him. That was the paradox. D'Angelo had spent decades outside the reach of conventional DNA searches, but his biological connection to other people ultimately helped investigators find him. The technology had effectively turned his family tree into a map leading back to him. Yet, even after the arrest, investigators faced the enormous task of determining how much of the Golden State Killer's criminal history could be tied to D'Angelo. The investigation involved crimes spread across years and jurisdictions. Authorities had to examine evidence, review case files, interview survivors, and establish which charges could be supported in court. The biological breakthrough did not automatically solve every individual crime. Instead, it gave investigators something they had never possessed before, a verified identity from which the rest of the case could be built. The arrest also forced the public to reconsider the timeline. D'Angelo had lived for decades after the known series of attacks ended. He had grown old. He had lived a life that, on the surface, did not resemble the terrifying figure described in police files. For survivors, that realization was deeply disturbing. The man who had been imagined as a permanently dangerous stranger had existed within ordinary society for decades. He had not been a ghost. He had been a person moving through the same world as everyone else. That contrast made the arrest feel almost surreal. The Golden State Killer had been a nightmare without a face. Now the nightmare had a name, an age, a history, and a physical location. But the DNA evidence remained the central threat. Without that biological evidence, the genetic genealogy investigation would not have had the same foundation. Without the original investigators who preserved evidence decades earlier, there might have been nothing for modern scientists to analyze. Without the forensic advances that allowed investigators to develop and compare DNA profiles, the case might have remained unsolved. And without genealogical databases and the willingness of researchers to examine family connections, the unknown profile might never have been linked to D'Angelo. The solution was therefore not the work of one person or one moment. It was the product of generations. Detectives from the 1970s and 1980s gathered evidence. Later, investigators connected cases. Scientists preserved and analyzed biological material. Genetic genealogists constructed family relationships. Modern detectives narrowed the suspect pool. And finally, prosecutors prepared the case for court. Every stage depended on the stage before it. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated something that cold case investigators had learned repeatedly. Evidence can become more valuable with time if it survives long enough for science to catch up. The biological material left behind by the offender had outlived the limitations of the technology available when it was collected. The evidence had waited. In 2018, the world finally learned what it had been waiting to say. The DNA belonged to Joseph James D'Angelo. The mystery that had lasted for decades had been reduced to a single identity, but solving the identity was only the beginning of the final chapter. Now the survivors would face the man accused of destroying their lives. Families would confront the person they had spent decades wondering about. Prosecutors would bring forward evidence collected over generations, and D'Angelo would have to answer in court for crimes that had once seemed almost impossible to solve. The Golden State Killer had been found through the past, but the consequences of that discovery belonged to the present, and the next question was no longer, who is the killer? It was something far more painful. What happens when the person you have waited 40 years to see finally stands before you? The DNA had given investigators a name, but a name could never capture the full weight of what had happened. For the survivors of the Golden State Killer attacks, Joseph James D'Angelo was not simply a 72-year-old man arrested in April 2018. He was the person investigators believed had been hiding behind decades of aliases, the person whose crimes had altered the course of their lives long before they knew who he was. For 40 years, many survivors had lived with uncertainty. Some knew exactly what had happened to them. They remembered the sounds, the fear, the helplessness, the questions that came afterward. What they did not know was who had done it. That absence of identity created a strange kind of unfinished story. There was a crime, but no confirmed offender. There was evidence, but no name. There was memory, but no courtroom conclusion. Then D'Angelo was arrested, and the distance between the past and the present suddenly collapsed. The man who had existed for decades as a police sketch, a description, a DNA profile, and a collection of terrifying aliases was now a real person facing criminal charges. The case moved rapidly from the world of cold case investigation into the public arena of prosecution. Prosecutors in California began assembling charges that reflected some of the most serious crimes attributed to D'Angelo. The allegations covered murders and kidnappings and represented a fraction of the broader criminal history connected to the Golden State Killer. The legal process was complicated by the passage of time. Decades had passed since the original crime. Evidence had to be reviewed. Witnesses and survivors had to be located. Investigators had to reconstruct events that had occurred long before many modern forensic procedures existed. Yet the central evidence remained remarkably powerful. DNA had not aged in the same way memories had. It could still provide the biological connection between the suspect and the original crime. That connection gave prosecutors the foundation for the case, but the courtroom would require more than laboratory results. It would require human testimony. Survivors would have the opportunity to speak about what had been taken from them. The Golden State Killer case had always been about numbers in police records, but behind every number was a person. Every assault had a survivor. Every murder had a family. Every burglary and intrusion had left behind a sense of vulnerability that could not simply be measured. The arrest forced those human stories back into public attention. Newspapers revisited the attacks. Television networks reconstructed the investigation. Former detectives described the years of frustration. Genetic genealogy experts explained how the breakthrough had happened. But for the people who had lived through the crimes, the most important development was simpler. The man responsible had finally been identified. The case had a fate. As prosecutors prepared the legal proceedings, the extraordinary age of the investigation became impossible to ignore. The first known attacks associated with the offender had occurred in 1976. By the time D'Angelo was arrested in 2018, more than 4 decades had passed. The world had changed almost beyond recognition. Technology had transformed communication, transportation, policing, and forensic science. Yet the original victims and their families had carried the past through all of those changes. Some had spent most of their adult lives knowing that the person who attacked them was still unidentified. Others had wondered whether they would ever see justice. Now that uncertainty was ending. But justice was not going to look like a Hollywood finale. There would be no dramatic explanation capable of making 40 years disappear. There would be no sentence capable of restoring the years lost. The legal system could establish responsibility and impose punishment, but it could not undo the crime. That distinction became particularly important as the prosecution moved toward resolution. The case was enormous. A full trial could have required extensive evidence, numerous witnesses, and a detailed reconstruction of crimes spanning multiple decades. D'Angelo's attorneys and prosecutors eventually negotiated a resolution. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. The plea covered crimes committed in several California counties and allowed prosecutors to avoid the uncertainty of a lengthy trial while ensuring that D'Angelo would receive a severe sentence. The plea also meant that survivors and families would not have to endure years of additional litigation before hearing the final judgment. When the guilty plea was entered, the Golden State Killer case reached a moment that had seemed impossible only a few years earlier. The unknown offender had not merely been identified. He had formally admitted guilt to the crimes represented by the charges. The man who had once been known only through aliases now stood before a court under his real name. But the courtroom proceedings were not simply about D'Angelo. They were about the people whose lives had been altered by his action. Victims and family members were given the opportunity to address the court during sentencing. Their statements carried the emotional weight of decades. Some had spent years believing the case might never be solved. Others had built new lives while still carrying memories of what happened. The passage of time had not erased the crime. It had simply changed the circumstances under which people remembered them. Then, in August 2020, the court sentenced D'Angelo to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence represented the formal conclusion of the prosecution, but even at that moment, the case remained larger than the legal count. Authorities had linked D'Angelo to a broader series of crimes than those covered by the charges. The FBI had previously described approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries associated with the offender between 1976 and 1986. Not every crime could be prosecuted in the same way, and not every survivor would necessarily receive the same courtroom resolution. Yet the identification of D'Angelo changed the historical record. The aliases could finally be connected to one person. Investigators could stop searching for an unknown offender. Families could stop wondering whether the killer would ever be identified. and the scientific method that solved the case became a landmark in the development of cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy had demonstrated its ability to turn decades-old DNA evidence into an investigative lead, and the Golden State Killer became one of the most famous examples of that transformation. But the technology also raised difficult questions. If investigators could use genetic information from relatives to identify an unknown suspect, where should the boundaries be drawn? How should privacy be protected? What rules should govern law enforcement's use of genealogy databases? The Golden State Killer case forced those questions into the national conversation because the breakthrough was so dramatic. The science had solved a mystery that traditional methods could not. At the same time, it demonstrated the enormous power contained within genetic information. The case therefore became both a criminal investigation and a turning point in forensic history. For investigators, it was proof that cold cases should not automatically be considered hopeless simply because decades have passed. For survivors, it was proof that evidence collected long ago could still matter. For families, it provided a measure of certainty. And for the public, it offered a chilling lesson. A person could evade identification for 40 years, but the biological evidence left behind could remain waiting. D'Angelo's guilty plea and sentence closed the central legal chapter, but they did not close every emotional chapter. Survivors still had to live with what happened. Families still had to remember those who were murdered. Communities still had to reconcile the fact that the predator who had terrified them had once been part of ordinary society. The image of the Golden State Killer as a mysterious figure in the darkness had been replaced by the reality of a man standing in a courtroom. Yet perhaps the most haunting element of the story was not the arrest itself. It was the realization that the case had been solved because the past had never completely disappeared. The evidence survived. The files survived. The memories survived, the DNA survived, and when technology finally caught up, all of those fragments could be assembled into a coherent picture. The case showed that time does not necessarily destroy every clue. Sometimes time simply hides the clue until the right method is invented. The Golden State Killer had spent decades beyond the reach of conventional identification, but he could not escape the biological evidence he had left behind. Eventually, that evidence crossed the gap between 1976 and 2018. It crossed the gap between an unknown offender and Joseph James D'Angelo, and it crossed the gap between a cold case and a courtroom. For the survivors, the most important change was not technological. It was personal. For decades, they had been forced to live with the possibility that the person who had attacked them would never be found. Then, suddenly, there was a name. There was an arrest. There was a guilty plea. There was a sentence. The silence that had lasted for 40 years had finally been broken. But silence is not the same as forgetting. The crimes remain part of the lives of those who survived them, part of the memories of families who lost loved ones, and part of the history of the communities where the attacks occurred. The Golden State Killer case ended in court, but the echoes of the investigation continue through the forensic techniques it helped bring into the spotlight. A biological trace left decades earlier became the key to an identity. A family tree became a path toward a suspect, and an investigation once thought to be trapped in the past proved that even after 40 years, a case could still move forward. The killer had tried to disappear into time. Time preserved the evidence instead, and when the evidence finally found its voice, it did something investigators had been waiting to hear since the first terrifying attacks. It gave the unknown man a name. When Joseph James D'Angelo entered the courtroom, the image of the Golden State Killer that had haunted California for more than 4 decades collided with the reality of an aging man standing before a judge. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. The crimes had begun in 1976. The arrest came in 2018. The legal consequences reached their final stage in 2020. Between those dates lay an entire lifetime of fear, investigation, grief, scientific progress, and unanswered questions. For the survivors, the courtroom was not simply another location in the investigation. It was the place where decades of uncertainty finally became evidence, testimony, and judgment. The person who had once been known only through descriptions and aliases now had to face the consequences of the crimes prosecutors had charged him with. Committing The case was no longer about an unknown predator moving through California neighborhoods. It was about Joseph James D'Angelo and the evidence that connected him to the crime. The DNA evidence that had helped identify him remained central to the story. But the courtroom also brought forward the human consequences that DNA alone could never describe. Survivors and relatives had spent years carrying memories that had never received a formal ending. Many had lived with the knowledge that the person responsible might never be caught. Others had wondered whether investigators would ever be able to prove what happened. The arrest changed that uncertainty. The guilty plea transformed it again. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. The plea represented a dramatic conclusion to a case that had once seemed almost impossible to solve. Prosecutors had been preparing for a massive trial involving evidence collected across decades and multiple California counties. Instead, the guilty plea provided a legal resolution without requiring every survivor and family member to endure a lengthy courtroom battle. But the plea did not erase the crimes. It confirmed them. The words spoken in court carried a weight that the old police reports could never fully capture. For decades, the victims had known what happened to them, but the public had known only fragments. Now, the person responsible had formally admitted guilt to the crimes covered by the charges. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unidentified offender. He was a convicted murderer. The sentencing proceedings became an extraordinary moment in the history of the case because victims and relatives could finally address D'Angelo directly. For years, the offender had controlled the narrative through fear. He chose when and where to attack. He disappeared before police could find him. His anonymity became part of his power. In court, that power was gone. The survivors and families were no longer speaking into the darkness. They were speaking in front of the man responsible. The atmosphere surrounding the proceedings reflected the passage of time. Some people who had waited for justice were now old. Some detectives who had investigated the original attacks were retired. Some victims and witnesses had died before the killer was identified. The case had outlived generations of investigators, yet those who remained carried the memories forward. The sentencing hearings gave them an opportunity to describe what the statistics could never explain. A murder count is one number. A kidnapping count is another. But behind every count was a human life, a family, a home, and a moment that could not be undone. D'Angelo eventually received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The punishment formally ended the criminal proceedings against him. But the broader history of the Golden State Killer extended beyond the charges. Authorities had associated the offender with approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries between 1976 and 1986. The prosecution could not necessarily bring every historical crime into the same courtroom, but the broader pattern remained part of the case's legacy. The sentencing therefore represented both an ending and a reminder of how much time had been lost. For decades had passed between the beginning of the known crime spree and the identification of D'Angelo. That gap became one of the most striking elements of the story. Modern audiences often imagine forensic investigations as fast-moving sequences of databases, laboratory tests, surveillance footage, and digital searches. The Golden State Killer case showed how different reality could be. For years, investigators had evidence but lacked the technology needed to convert it into an identity. The breakthrough required patience. It required preservation. It required scientists who could revisit old evidence with new techniques. It required genealogists who could build family trees from genetic relationships. It required detectives who could connect those genealogical findings to traditional investigative information. And it required prosecutors who could eventually bring the evidence into court. The case was therefore not solved by DNA alone. It was solved by a chain of human decisions stretching across generations. Someone had to collect the biological evidence. Someone had to preserve it. Someone had to believe the case was still solvable. Someone had to develop the forensic technology. Someone had to recognize that genealogy could provide an investigative pathway. Someone had to build the family tree. Someone had to identify D'Angelo as a plausible suspect. Someone had to obtain confirmatory DNA. And someone had to bring the evidence into court. Every link mattered. Remove one, and the case might have remained unsolved. That is why the Golden State Killer investigation became so important to the future of cold cases. It demonstrated that an investigation could effectively pause for decades without truly ending. The case file could become old, but the evidence could remain relevant. The technology could change. The investigators could change. The questions could change. But the evidence could still be weighted. The arrest of D'Angelo also generated a powerful psychological shift. For decades, people had imagined the Golden State Killer as an unknown figure whose whereabouts were impossible to determine. After the arrest, the mystery became a history. The unknown man was no longer moving through the imagination. He was sitting in a courtroom. That transformation mattered because fear thrives on uncertainty. An unidentified offender can become almost mythological. Every unanswered question expands the possibilities. Was he still alive? Was he watching the investigation? Could he attack again? Did he live nearby? Was he someone victims had passed on the street? Did he have a family? Did he work in an ordinary profession? Once D'Angelo was identified, many of those questions disappeared. But other questions became even more disturbing. How had he lived for decades without being identified? How had investigators missed him? How had a man with a law enforcement background managed to remain outside the reach of the investigation? And how many people had crossed paths with him without knowing the history attached to his name? Those questions became part of the case's lasting fascination. The story was not simply about a killer who was finally caught. It was about the limits of human memory and the power of scientific evidence. The witnesses had provided descriptions. Investigators had created sketches. Detectives had followed leads. But DNA eventually provided the connection that decades of conventional investigation could not establish, and genetic genealogy provided the bridge that made that DNA actionable. The result changed the perception of what a cold case could be. If the Golden State Killer could be identified after 40 years, then other unidentified offenders might also be reachable through preserved biological evidence and modern genealogy. The case helped demonstrate the potential of a forensic approach that could transform an unknown DNA profile into a family relationship and eventually into a suspect. But the scientific success did not diminish the human tragedy. Solving a case does not mean the victims are restored to the lives they had before the crime. It does not remove trauma. It does not bring murdered loved ones back. It does not erase decades of unanswered questions. What it can provide is certainty, and certainty has enormous value. For families, knowing who was responsible can end the endless cycle of speculation. For survivors, seeing the offender convicted can provide a legal acknowledgement of what happened. For investigators, it can validate years of work. For communities, it can finally close a chapter that had remained open for generations. Yet even after D'Angelo received his sentence, the story continued to echo. The Golden State Killer case became a symbol of how a cold case can survive time, how evidence can outlive an investigation, and how new science can reopen doors that once appeared permanently locked. The case also became a warning about the limitations of relying on one generation's technology to solve crimes that may eventually be examined by another. The investigators of the 1970s could not know what forensic genealogy would become in the 2010s. They could only preserve what they had. That preservation became their legacy. The biological evidence they collected became a message sent into the future. Decades later, another generation of investigators finally learned how to read it. The result was astonishing. A crime spree that had once seemed to belong to another era suddenly became a modern criminal investigation. A man who had spent decades as an unknown suspect became a named defendant. A family tree became an investigative weapon, and a 72-year-old man became the final link between a decades-old DNA profile and a terrifying criminal history. The Golden State Killer case had begun with fear in quiet neighborhoods. It had survived years of false leads and investigative frustration. It had passed through generations of detectives. It had entered the age of forensic genealogy. And finally, it reached a courtroom where the unknown became known. D'Angelo's sentence could not rewrite history, but it established something that had been missing for 40 years: accountability. The silence had not erased the crimes. The passage of time had not defeated the evidence, and the killer's greatest advantage, his anonymity, had finally disappeared. The Golden State Killer case had already shocked the world by the time Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested, but its greatest impact was not limited to the identity of one man. The investigation demonstrated how dramatically the meaning of DNA evidence had changed over the course of 4 decades, and it revealed something that investigators had learned the hard way. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the evidence is simply waiting for the right technology, the right database, the right question, and the right investigator to bring it back to light. When the first attacks attributed to the Golden State Killer began in California in 1976, DNA profiling, as modern investigators know, it did not exist. Police depended on fingerprints, blood typing, eyewitness descriptions, physical evidence, photographs, sketches, and conventional investigative technique. The biological material left at crime scenes could be collected and preserved, but investigators could not yet extract the kind of individualized genetic profile that would later become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation. That meant evidence could exist without being fully understood. The killer could leave something behind, and investigators could preserve it without knowing that decades later, the same material might become the key to identifying him. As the science developed, DNA testing transformed forensic investigation. Investigators could establish that biological evidence recovered from separate crimes came from the same unknown individual. In the Golden State Killer investigation, that capability was crucial. The DNA profile connected crimes that had occurred years and hundreds of miles apart. It helped demonstrate that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were not necessarily separate offenders, but identities associated with the same criminal investigation. That connection changed the scale of the case. What had once appeared to be a collection of frightening but separate crimes could now be understood as part of a much larger pattern. Yet DNA still had a limitation. It could identify a person only if investigators had something to compare the profile against. If the offender was not already in a relevant database, the DNA could remain unidentified. This was the situation investigators faced for years. They knew the biological profile belonged to the offender. They could compare it with suspects and eliminate people, but the profile did not automatically generate a name. It was a locked door. Then genetic genealogy changed the question. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA directly matched an individual in a law enforcement database, investigators could search for relatives connected through genetic markers. The approach was fundamentally different. It used family relationships as an investigative pathway. The unknown offender did not have to be personally present in a database. A distant relative might be. That relative could provide a starting point for genealogical research. Researchers could construct a family tree, move backward through generations, identify branches, and then move forward again toward people who fit the known circumstances of the crime. The process was painstaking and required careful verification, but it offered something the traditional approach could not: a path toward an offender who had never been directly identified through conventional DNA searching. In the Golden State Killer investigation, this method proved decisive. Investigators developed a genetic genealogy lead that eventually narrowed their attention to Joseph James D'Angelo. The discovery did not mean that investigators simply typed a name into a computer and received an answer. It required interpretation. Genetic relationships can identify families, not automatically individual criminals. Investigators had to combine genetic information with age, geography, history, and other evidence. The process moved from the abstract world of genetic relationships into the concrete world of police investigation. Eventually, D'Angelo emerged as a viable suspect. The next step was confirmation. Investigators obtained DNA associated with him and compared it with the profile developed from the crimes. The match transformed the genealogical lead into forensic evidence. On April 24th, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested. The arrest immediately became a landmark moment in criminal investigation. A case that had survived for more than 40 years had been solved using a combination of old evidence and new science. The DNA was old. The technology was new. The crimes belonged to another generation. The investigation belonged to the present. That combination was what made the case so powerful. The Golden State Killer had not been defeated because investigators suddenly discovered a new piece of evidence at a crime scene. They defeated him because evidence collected decades earlier was re-examined through a new scientific framework. The implications were enormous. If genetic genealogy could identify the Golden State Killer, then perhaps it could also help identify other unknown offenders whose DNA profiles had remained in police files for decades. Investigators across the United States began considering cases that had once seemed impossible. Unidentified remains, unsolved murders, sexual assaults, and other cold cases could potentially be revisited. The method became increasingly associated with a new generation of forensic investigation, but the technique also raised questions about privacy and consent. Traditional DNA databases used by law enforcement were designed around criminal justice. Genetic genealogy databases were created for people interested in ancestry and family history. The possibility that a person's genetic information could indirectly help identify a relative suspected of a crime created a complicated ethical and legal debate. The Golden State Killer case therefore became more than a story about catching one murderer. It became a national conversation about what genetic information could reveal and how far investigators should be allowed to go when using it. The scientific breakthrough was undeniable, but so was the power it demonstrated. DNA does not simply describe one person, it can reveal biological relationships among many people. That means an investigation targeting one unknown suspect can potentially involve information connected to relatives who had nothing to do with the crime. The Golden State Killer case helped force law enforcement, genealogists, scientists, and the public to confront that reality. Yet for the victims, the scientific debate was secondary to something much more immediate. They wanted to know who had attacked them. They wanted the uncertainty to end. They wanted the person responsible to face justice. The technology succeeded because it answered those questions. D'Angelo's later guilty plea and sentence provided the legal conclusion. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings, and in August 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case had moved from anonymous DNA to genealogical lead, from genealogical lead to suspect, from suspect to arrest, and from arrest to conviction. Each stage demonstrated a different principle of modern cold case investigation. Preserve evidence, re-examine old assumptions, connect cases across jurisdictions, use emerging technology, verify every lead, and never assume that time alone makes a crime unsolvable. The Golden State Killer investigation also revealed the importance of persistence across generations. The detectives who originally collected evidence could not have known exactly how that evidence would eventually be used. They could not have predicted genetic genealogy. They could not have imagined databases containing millions of genetic profiles. They could not have known that decades later, investigators would use family relationships to identify a suspect. But they preserved the evidence anyway. That decision became critical. The biological material survived. The investigative files survived. The memory of the crime survived. Eventually, science caught up. In that sense, the solution was not created in 2018. It was built over 40 years. The 1970s investigators laid the foundation. The 1980s investigators continued the search. Later, detectives consolidated the information. Scientists developed better methods. Genealogists provided a new investigative route, and modern investigators assembled the pieces. The final breakthrough was therefore a chain reaction across time. One generation collected the clue, another preserved it, another developed the technology, another learned how to interpret it, and eventually the clue led directly to Joseph James D'Angelo. The case also demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of forensic evidence. A biological trace can remain meaningful long after a crime scene has disappeared. A house can be renovated. A neighborhood can change. A witness can grow old. A detective can retire, but properly preserved biological evidence can remain available for future analysis. That is why the Golden State Killer case became such an important symbol for cold case investigators. It suggested that the passage of time does not automatically destroy the possibility of justice. Sometimes it simply creates a delay between evidence and technology. The killer's greatest advantage had been the era in which he committed his crime. But decades later, the same evidence collected during that era became the reason he could no longer remain anonymous. The very thing that once seemed insufficient DNA without a name eventually became the foundation of his identification. The transformation was almost poetic. For years, the DNA profile represented a mystery. It proved that the offender existed, but not who he was. Genetic genealogy changed that. The profile became a family connection. The family connection became a tree. The tree became a suspect. The suspect became Joseph James D'Angelo, and the name became a conviction. The Golden State Killer had spent decades hidden behind anonymity, but anonymity was ultimately the one thing science could destroy. A face can change with age. A witness's memory can fade. A criminal can move. A name can be concealed. DNA remains, and in this case, DNA waited 40 years for the world to learn how to listen. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer existed in the public imagination as a shadow, a figure who could enter a home at night, terrify its occupants, leave behind evidence, and disappear before anyone could identify him. But when investigators finally placed a name beside the DNA profile in 2018, the most unsettling discovery was not simply that the killer had survived for decades without being caught. It was that the man investigators identified had spent those decades living an apparently ordinary life. Joseph James D'Angelo was 72 when authorities arrested him, an age that seemed almost impossible when compared with the terrifying crimes attributed to the offender during the 1970s and 1980s. The contrast between the elderly suspect and the younger man described in decades-old investigative records created a disturbing sense of time collapsing. The police sketches belonged to another era. The victims had grown older. Detectives had retired. Neighborhoods had changed, yet the biological evidence had remained connected to the same person. The name Joseph James D'Angelo suddenly linked the past to the present. He had not been a mythical figure. He had been a man living among other people, moving through ordinary routines while investigators continued searching for the offender whose DNA had haunted their file. One of the details that drew particular attention was D'Angelo's former career in law enforcement. He had worked as a police officer in California, making the eventual identification even more disturbing because the person investigators had spent years trying to understand had once been part of the law enforcement system itself. His background did not automatically reveal the crimes, but after the DNA identification, it became another piece of a much larger picture. The public began asking how someone with knowledge of police procedures could have remained unidentified for so long. How had investigators missed him? How many times had his name appeared somewhere in records without anyone realizing its significance? How had the investigation continued for decades while the man himself grew older? These questions were difficult because the answer was not a single mistake. The Golden State Killer investigation had been complicated by geography, time, technology, incomplete information, and the limitations of the era in which the crimes occurred. The offender had moved between communities, and different law enforcement agencies had initially investigated different portions of his criminal history. The aliases reflected this fragmentation. In Northern California, he was known as the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, investigators eventually connected similar crimes to the original Night Stalker. Only later did investigators establish that these identities belonged to the same offender. The fragmented nature of the investigation gave the killer an enormous advantage. A detective looking at one crime might not have access to another case hundreds of miles away. A witness might remember one detail while another remembered something completely different. Evidence collected under older forensic standards might not have been immediately useful. The case, therefore, required investigators to think across decades and jurisdictions. DNA eventually provided that connection. Biological evidence established that the same offender was responsible for multiple crimes, creating a forensic bridge across geography. But even then, the bridge stopped at an unknown identity. Investigators could see the offender's biological signature, but they could not see his name. That changed with genetic genealogy. The technique allowed investigators to use genetic relationships to search for family connections to the unknown offender. Instead of searching only for a direct DNA match, investigators could identify possible relatives and use genealogical research to construct a family network. This network eventually led investigators toward Joseph D'Angelo. The method was powerful because it did not depend on D'Angelo having been previously arrested or voluntarily submitting his own DNA to a law enforcement database. His genetic relatives could provide the indirect connection. From there, investigators could narrow possibilities based on age, location, family history, and other known information. The process turned an enormous population into a manageable investigative field. But even after D'Angelo emerged as a suspect, investigators still needed confirmation. They obtained biological evidence associated with him and compared it with the crime scene DNA. The match transformed suspicion into forensic evidence. On April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested. The arrest was extraordinary not only because it solved a 40-year-old mystery, but because it demonstrated how completely the passage of time could be defeated by evidence. The killer had aged. The technology had changed. The investigators had changed. But the DNA remained. That biological continuity was the one thing D'Angelo could not outlive. His appearance had changed over the decades, but the genetic profile recovered from the crimes remained consistent. The case therefore revealed the limitations of relying too heavily on appearance, memory, or conventional suspect profile. Investigators had been searching for a younger man because the crimes had been committed decades earlier. The person eventually arrested was an elderly man. Time had transformed the suspect's physical appearance while leaving the biological evidence essentially unchanged. This is one reason cold cases can be so difficult. A photograph or eyewitness description captures a person at one moment. DNA captures something much more stable. A witness may remember the face of a young man. Decades later, investigators may be looking at an older man whose appearance bears little resemblance to that memory. The biological evidence does not face the same problem. It remains a link across generations. When the arrest became public, the reaction was immediate. People who had followed the case for decades could finally attach a real identity to the names that had dominated California's criminal history. The East Area Rapist was no longer simply a terrifying label. The original Night Stalker was no longer an unknown figure in Southern California. The Golden State Killer was no longer a mystery. The aliases converged on Joseph James D'Angelo. But the revelation also produced another kind of shock. D'Angelo's life after the crimes appeared ordinary enough that he had not been living under the identity of a fugitive hiding in some remote location. The image of a criminal constantly looking over his shoulder was replaced by the reality of someone who had apparently managed to remain outside the investigation for decades. That realization made the case even more unsettling. It showed that a person does not necessarily have to disappear physically to disappear from an investigation. Sometimes anonymity can be maintained through the simple passage of time. The world moves forward. New crimes dominate police attention. Old detectives retire. Evidence is archived. The public forgets. The suspect grows older. The case becomes part of history. Then, one scientific breakthrough can reopen everything. The arrest also forced investigators and the public to reconsider the meaning of the word cold. The case had been cold in the sense that there had been no identified offender for decades, but it had never been empty. There was evidence, there were records, there were survivors, there were investigators who refused to let the case disappear completely. The coldness came from the lack of a name. Once genetic genealogy supplied a path toward that name, the case changed rapidly. Within months, the investigation moved from a decades-old mystery to an arrest and then toward prosecution. The speed of that transformation was astonishing. For 40 years, the case had barely seemed to move. Then, in 2018, it moved faster than almost anyone could have imagined. The arrest also revealed the power of combining old-fashioned police work with modern science. Genetic genealogy created the lead, But traditional investigations still mattered. Investigators had to examine D'Angelo's history, assess whether he fit the known facts, obtain confirmatory biological evidence, and build a prosecutable case. No single technology solved the entire investigation. Instead, the technology opened the door and investigators walked through it. That distinction is important because the Golden State Killer case is sometimes remembered simply as a DNA success story. It was more than that. It was a decades-long collaboration between evidence preservation, forensic science, genealogy, police work, and prosecution. Every part of the system had to function. The DNA had to survive. The genealogy had to produce a meaningful lead. The investigators had to identify the right person. The confirmation had to withstand legal scrutiny, and the prosecution had to translate decades of evidence into a courtroom case. The result was Joseph James D'Angelo's guilty plea in 2020 and his sentence to life in prison without parole. Yet the question of how he remained unidentified for so long continues to fascinate investigators and the public. It is tempting to imagine that one missed clue explains everything, but the reality was more complicated. The crimes began in an era before modern DNA profiling. The investigation crossed jurisdiction. The offender used different geographic patterns and identities. Technology limited what could be done with biological evidence, and time itself became a shield. Each passing year increased the distance between the crimes and the suspect's present-day appearance. But the same time that protected him also preserved the evidence. That is, the paradox at the center of the case. Time was both the killer's ally and the investigator's eventual weapon. For decades, time allowed the mystery to grow. Then technology turned time into a resource. The DNA had survived long enough for genetic genealogy to become possible. The evidence had waited for science. When science finally arrived, the killer's anonymity collapsed. Joseph James D'Angelo could no longer hide behind the passage of years. The name was known. The DNA was matched. The charges were filed. The guilty plea followed. And the man who had once seemed almost untouchable was now serving a sentence that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. But the most haunting aspect of the case remains the simplest one. For 40 years, people had wondered what happened to the man who committed those crimes. The answer was not that he vanished. He stayed. He aged. He lived. He existed somewhere inside the same society that had spent decades searching for him. The Golden State Killer had not escaped the path. He had simply carried it with him until science finally found a way to uncover it. For 4 decades, the Golden State Killer investigation carried a strange contradiction at its center. Investigators had enough evidence to know that the same unknown offender had committed a terrifying series of crimes, yet they lacked the one piece of information that would transform evidence into justice: the man's identity. The DNA profile was there. The crime scenes were documented. The survivors were alive. The case files remained. But the name was missing. That single absence kept the investigation suspended between certainty and mystery. Authorities knew they were looking for one man, but they could not say who he was. They knew his biological signature, but they could not attach it to a person. They knew the crimes were connected, but the connections stretched across decades and jurisdictions. Then, in 2018, the past suddenly became present again. The breakthrough began with a method that had barely existed when the crimes occurred: investigative genetic genealogy. The concept was revolutionary because it changed what investigators meant when they searched DNA. Traditional forensic DNA analysis asks whether a sample matches a known individual. Genetic genealogy can instead reveal biological relationships and help investigators work through a family tree toward an unidentified person. In the Golden State Killer investigation, that difference was decisive. The unknown offender's DNA did not need to be directly stored under his own name. Investigators could look for relatives. Those relatives could provide clues about family lines. Genealogical researchers could examine generations of relationships. Investigators could then combine those relationships with traditional information about the suspect's age, geography, and history. The result was a narrowing process that eventually focused attention on Joseph James D'Angelo. The process did not prove guilt by itself. A genealogical connection could only create a lead. investigators still needed independent confirmation. That confirmation came through DNA collected from D'Angelo and compared with the biological evidence preserved from the crime. The result connected him to the offender profile that investigators had carried for decades. On April 24, 2018, authorities arrested D'Angelo. The moment was extraordinary because the arrest represented the convergence of two completely different eras. The crimes belonged to the 1970s and 1980s. The technology that solved the identity belonged to the 21st century. The evidence had survived the transition. The killer had not been identified by the tools available at the time of the crime. He had been identified by tools developed long afterward. That is why the Golden State Killer case became so important to cold case investigators. It demonstrated that evidence can have a future even when investigators cannot immediately see it. The biological material recovered decades earlier had not become irrelevant simply because it was old. Its value increased as scientific methods improved. The DNA profile that once seemed incapable of producing an identity became the starting point for a genealogical search. The genealogical search produced a suspect. The suspect's DNA provided confirmation, and confirmation produced an arrest. The chain was almost impossible to imagine when the first attacks occurred, but once the technology existed, the process moved quickly. For survivors, the speed of the final breakthrough was almost surreal. They had spent decades hearing that the case remained unsolved. They had watched investigators release sketches, announce rewards, and appeal for information. Some had likely wondered whether the offender would ever be identified. Then suddenly, there was a name. Joseph James D'Angelo, a 72-year-old man, had been arrested in connection with crimes that had terrified California decades earlier. The public reaction was enormous. News organizations around the world reported the arrest. Former detectives returned to interviews. Survivors and relatives were contacted. The case was reopened in the public imagination. The man who had been described through aliases and sketches was now being identified by his real name. Yet the arrest did not immediately answer every question. Investigators still had to determine the full scope of D'Angelo's criminal activity. The Golden State Killer case involved crimes across multiple California counties, and the prosecution eventually focused on charges that included 13 murders and 13 kidnappings. The FBI had previously described a much broader pattern involving approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries between 1976 and 1986. The difference between the broader historical pattern and the charges filed in court is important. A cold case investigation can establish connections that cannot always be translated into criminal counts. Evidence may be insufficient for a particular prosecution. Statutes and jurisdictional issues may affect what can be charged. Witnesses may no longer be available, but the identification of the offender can still provide answers, even when not every crime receives the same legal resolution. The prosecution moved forward while investigators continued examining the history connected to D'Angelo. The sheer passage of time made the case unusual. Some evidence was more than 40 years old. Some survivors had spent most of their adult lives without knowing who had attacked them. Some detectives who had investigated the original crimes were no longer working, yet the case had reached the courtroom because the evidence had survived. The guilty plea in 2020 marked another dramatic turning point. D'Angelo admitted guilt to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. The plea brought legal certainty to charges that had remained unresolved for decades. Instead of forcing survivors and families through a prolonged trial, the case moved directly towards sentencing. For those who had waited 40 years, the courtroom was no longer simply a place where evidence would be argued. It became the place where the unknown finally became accountable. The sentencing hearings carried a different kind of tension from the original investigation. The fear was no longer about whether the killer would strike again. The uncertainty was about how survivors would confront the person who had once controlled their lives through violence and anonymity. In court, the power dynamic had changed completely. The offender could no longer disappear. His name was known. His DNA had been matched. His crimes had been documented. His victims could speak. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal system had reached its conclusion, But the broader story continued to resonate because of what the case demonstrated about forensic science. Genetic genealogy had transformed an unidentified DNA profile into a family network and then into a suspect. The technique quickly became associated with other cold case investigations, although its use also generated debate about privacy, consent, and the boundaries of law enforcement access to genetic information. The Golden State Killer investigation therefore became a turning point, not only because it solved a famous case, but because it showed how much information could be hidden inside a DNA profile. A person does not exist genetically in isolation. Every individual is connected to relatives through inherited DNA. That means investigators searching for one unknown person can potentially find clues through people who have never been suspected of a crime. The implications were enormous. If an unknown offender had a cousin who had submitted DNA for genealogy, that cousin could potentially provide the first clue. From that clue, investigators could build a family tree. The family tree could reveal possible suspects. Traditional investigation could then determine whether those suspects fit the circumstances. This approach effectively expanded the investigative reach of forensic DNA. The Golden State Killer case became the dramatic proof of concept. Yet beneath the scientific achievement was a much older lesson. Never assume that a case is finished simply because it is old. The evidence may still be waiting. A cold case can remain dormant for years and then move suddenly when a new method becomes available. The Golden State Killer investigation had experienced that transformation in spectacular fashion. For decades, investigators were stuck at the same point. They knew the DNA belonged to the offender, but they did not know the name. Then the genealogical approach created a path forward. The case went from an anonymous profile to a family tree, from a family tree to Joseph D'Angelo, and from Joseph D'Angelo to a confirmed DNA match. The progression was almost mathematical in its simplicity, but the human work behind it was enormous. Every branch of the genealogy had to be examined. Every possibility had to be tested. Every investigative assumption had to be challenged. The final answer depended on patience. The Golden State Killer had survived because the investigation could not yet translate the evidence. Once that translation became possible, the mystery collapsed. And that is perhaps the most powerful lesson of the entire case. The killer was not caught because the evidence suddenly appeared. The evidence had been there all along. The DNA had been waiting in silence. The files had been waiting. The memories had been waiting. The survivors had been waiting. The science simply needed time to catch up. When it finally did, 40 years of uncertainty could be transformed into one name: Joseph James D'Angelo. The name that investigators had been missing since 1976. The name that finally connected the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer to a single individual. The name that turned a biological profile into a person and a cold case into a conviction. And once that name became public, the mystery could never return to what it had been. The shadow had a face. The DNA had an identity. The silence had finally been broken. The conviction of Joseph James D'Angelo brought an extraordinary legal conclusion to one of California's most notorious criminal investigations. But for the people who had spent decades living with the consequences, the end of the courtroom process did not mean the end of the story, because justice and closure are not the same thing. And the Golden State Killer case had left behind wounds that could not be measured by a sentence, a DNA match, or a guilty plea. For years, the investigation had been defined by uncertainty. Detectives knew a dangerous offender was responsible for a series of crimes. Survivors knew what had happened to them. Families knew what had been lost, but nobody could identify the man behind the crimes. That uncertainty created its own form of punishment. Every year that passed without an arrest raised the possibility that the case might remain unsolved forever. The offender could die without being identified. Evidence could deteriorate. Witnesses could disappear. Memories could fade. Detectives could retire. The investigation could become another forgotten file in a vast archive of unsolved crime. Instead, the opposite happened. The case survived. The evidence survived. And eventually, modern science transformed what had once seemed like an impossible mystery into a prosecutable case. But the final resolution also forced everyone to confront a disturbing question. What does justice mean when it arrives 40 years late? For the survivors, there was no single answer. Some found meaning in seeing D'Angelo identified and convicted. Some found strength in speaking publicly. Others had spent so many years rebuilding their lives that the sudden return of the case brought complicated emotions. The arrest was not simply the capture of a criminal. It was the reopening of memories that had been carried silently for decades. The name Joseph James D'Angelo suddenly appeared everywhere, but for the survivors, the name represented something much more personal. It represented the man investigators said had been responsible for the terror that entered their homes and changed their lives. The public could read about the case, watch documentaries, examine old photographs, and discuss the forensic breakthrough. Survivors did not have that distance. They remembered the reality behind the headline. That difference became increasingly important as the case received worldwide attention. The Golden State Killer had become a symbol of forensic science, but he was also the center of a human tragedy involving dozens of victims and families. The FBI has described the offender's known criminal history as including approximately 45 rapes, 12 homicides, and numerous burglaries committed between 1976 and 1986. The crimes stretched across California and were investigated over many years under different names and by different agencies. The scale of that history meant that even after D'Angelo's conviction, there remained a larger question about the full impact of the crime. A courtroom could resolve specific charges, but it could not recreate every crime or provide every survivor with the same legal experience. Some crimes occurred too long ago. Some evidence could not support prosecution. Some victims remained outside the formal proceeding. Yet the identification of D'Angelo changed the historical understanding of all of them. The man who had once existed as separate aliases and separate investigative theories was now connected to a single identity. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer were no longer mysteries without a face. The convergence of those identities represented one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of American cold case investigation. It also demonstrated the importance of cooperation across agencies. For years, the investigation had been divided by geography. Northern California detectives investigated the East Area Rapist crimes, while Southern California authorities investigated crimes attributed to the original Night Stalker. The realization that the same offender was responsible for both series helped create a unified understanding of the criminal pattern. DNA was central to establishing that connection. But even after investigators understood that the crimes were connected, the offender remained unidentified. That was the problem genetic genealogy eventually solved. It did not replace traditional police work. It expanded it. Investigators still had to understand the original crimes, preserve the evidence, evaluate suspects, and confirm the genetic lead. The breakthrough was therefore not a single technological miracle. It was the result of decades of accumulated knowledge. Every old report mattered. Every preserved sample mattered. Every detective who refused to discard the case mattered. Every scientist who improved DNA analysis mattered. Every genealogical connection that narrowed the possibilities mattered. And when those pieces finally converged, the investigation moved with astonishing speed. On April 24th, SIL 2018, D'Angelo was arrested at his home in the Sacramento area. He was 72 years old. That image became one of the most striking symbols of the case. The offender described in the original investigations had been a younger man. The suspect in 2018 was an elderly former police officer. For decades had changed his appearance, his age, and the world around him, but the biological evidence had remained constant. The DNA did not care how much time had passed. It did not care that the suspect had grown older. It did not care that detectives who originally investigated the crimes had retired. It simply provided a biological connection. That is why the case became such a powerful demonstration of the durability of forensic evidence. Human beings age. Technology evolves. Institutions change. Evidence, when properly preserved, can wait, and in the Golden State Killer case, it waited long enough for science to catch up. The arrest also changed the psychological landscape for the communities that had lived under the shadow of the offender. For decades, there had been no certainty about whether the killer was still alive, whether he remained in California, or whether he might ever be identified. After the arrest, the fear associated with the unknown offender could finally be replaced the reality of a person in custody. But the revelation that D'Angelo had spent decades living an apparently ordinary life added another layer of unease. He had not vanished into some distant wilderness. He had remained part of society. He had aged like everyone else. He had lived through the same decades that the victims had lived through. The world had changed around him while the investigation remained unresolved. That fact became one of the most unsettling elements of the case. It demonstrated how effectively time can conceal a person's past. The crimes belonged to an earlier era, and the suspect's later life existed in a completely different social landscape. Without the DNA evidence, there might have been no obvious bridge between those two versions of reality. Genetic genealogy became that bridge. The family connections led investigators toward D'Angelo, and the confirmatory DNA comparison provided the crucial forensic evidence. After the arrest came the legal process, and in June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for robbery. The guilty plea meant that the case would not require a full trial on those charges, but it also meant that the man at the center of the investigation formally accepted responsibility for the crimes to which he pleaded guilty. For survivors and families, that moment carried a significance that no scientific breakthrough could provide. DNA could identify, genealogy could connect. Police could arrest, but only the criminal justice system could formally establish guilt through a conviction. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought the legal chapter to a close, but the broader legacy of the investigation was already becoming much larger than the defendant himself. Genetic genealogy had moved from the margins of forensic discussion into the center of public attention. Investigators began looking at other cold cases with a new sense of possibility. Unknown DNA profiles that had remained unidentified for decades could potentially be examined through genealogical methods. Cases involving unidentified remains could potentially be approached from another direction. The technology offered a new pathway into mysteries that had resisted conventional investigation, but with that power came difficult questions about privacy. Genetic information is different from many other forms of evidence because it does not belong only to one individual. A person's DNA also contains information about biological relatives. When someone voluntarily submits genetic material to a genealogy service, the consequences may extend beyond that person's own identity. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated how investigators could potentially use genetic relationships to move toward an unknown suspect. That achievement generated admiration, but it also forced society to debate where the boundaries should exist. How should law enforcement use genealogy databases? What level of consent should be required? What protections should exist for relatives who never expected their genetic information to become relevant to a criminal investigation? These questions became part of the legacy of the D'Angelo case because the same technology that helped deliver justice also revealed an unprecedented investigative capability. Yet beneath every debate about databases and forensic science was a simpler truth. The technology worked because someone had left biological evidence behind. The evidence had survived because investigators had preserved it, and the case remained solvable because people refused to believe that 40 years automatically meant the end. The Golden State Killer investigation therefore became a lesson in patience. A cold case may appear frozen, but evidence can continue to move through time even when an investigation seems motionless. The original detectives could not know that genetic genealogy would one day exist. They could not know that the DNA profile would eventually be compared through family relationship. They could not know that the suspect would still be alive when science finally caught up. They could only collect what they found and preserve it. Decades later, that decision became the foundation of justice. The case also changed the meaning of an unanswered question. For years, who was the Golden State Killer? Had been one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime? After 2018, that question disappeared, but it was replaced by another. How many other cold cases contain evidence that has not yet been fully understood? The answer remains unknown. Somewhere in evidence rooms and archives, there may be biological material collected decades ago that has never been fully analyzed by today's technology. Somewhere there may be a family waiting for an answer. Somewhere there may be an investigator looking at an old file and wondering whether science has finally advanced enough to solve it. That possibility became one of the most enduring lessons of the Golden State Killer case. The passage of time does not necessarily destroy truth. Sometimes it simply hides it. 40 years of silence had surrounded the crime. Then a strand of DNA, preserved across decades, became the thread that connected the past to the present. The thread led through a family tree toward a suspect, into a laboratory, and finally into a courtroom. And when the final judgment was delivered, the mystery that had terrified California for generations had changed forever. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown figure moving through the darknet. He was Joseph James D'Angelo, convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. But the most powerful legacy of the case was not the name. It was the proof that evidence can outlive the person who collected it, outlive the technology that first examined it, and outlive the assumptions of an entire generation. For 40 years, the truth had been present. The world simply had not yet learned how to hear it. The Golden State Killer case had reached a legal conclusion, but the investigation left behind a much larger question that extended far beyond Joseph James D'Angelo. How many other killers had escaped identification simply because the technology needed to expose them did not yet exist? That question transformed the case from a notorious California investigation into a landmark in the modern history of cold cases, because the breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession, a forgotten witness suddenly appearing, or a hidden object discovered in an abandoned building. It came from something that had been sitting quietly in the evidence for decades. DNA, the biological evidence, had been collected long before genetic genealogy became a practical investigative tool. At the time, investigators could not have known how valuable that evidence would eventually become. They could only preserve it. That decision became critical. The evidence survived the years when the case seemed frozen. It survived changes in investigative personnel, changes in forensic technology, and changes in public attention. And eventually, it became the foundation for identifying Joseph James D'Angelo. The significance of that development was enormous because traditional DNA searching had reached a dead end. Investigators had an unknown profile belonging to the offender, but there was no direct identification in the databases available to them. The profile could prove that the same person was responsible for multiple crimes, but it could not simply announce his name. Genetic genealogy changed that equation by allowing investigators to search for biological relatives and construct family connections. Instead of looking directly for the unknown man, investigators could look sideways through his genetic family. That approach required patience and expertise. A genetic match to a relative does not identify a criminal automatically. It provides a relationship, not a conviction. Investigators must then build a genealogical structure, examine generations, eliminate people who do not fit the facts, and determine whether the remaining candidates are consistent with the evidence. In the Golden State Killer investigation, that process eventually pointed toward D'Angelo, but the genealogical lead was only one stage. Investigators still needed confirmation. The DNA comparison involving D'Angelo provided that confirmation.